Abigail Carter slammed her palm flat against the work table so hard the scissors rattled across the floor. Her sister had done it again, without asking, without warning, without a single word. Emma had written to a stranger, a ranching man. Abigail had never once laid eyes on and told him to come to Willow Ridge, Montana, and knock on her little sister's door like Abigail was some broken clock that needed fixing. And now that stranger was standing on her porch, hat in his hand, dust on his boots, waiting. If you've ever been loved by someone who went too far trying to save you, stay with me because this story is going to reach somewhere deep. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single moment, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Let's begin. The summer of 1886 pressed down on Willow Ridge, Montana, like a hot iron on cheap cotton. The kind of heat that cracked window frames and turned the main road to dust so fine it coated your teeth if you talked too long. Most folks retreated to shade by mid-afternoon. Most folks had somewhere comfortable to go. Abigail Carter had her workshop. It wasn't much from the outside, a narrow building wedged between the feed store and the post office with a hand-lettered sign above the door that read, "Carter Seamstress and Alterations." The paint on that sign had faded 2 summers ago, and she kept meaning to repaint it, kept buying the paint and then setting it aside because there was always another order. Waiting. Always another pair of work trousers that needed reinforcing at the knee. Always another ranch wife who needed a dress let out or taken in before Sunday. Abigail didn't mind the work. The work was the one place in her life where nobody had anything ugly to say. She was 30 years old, and she had learned slowly, painfully, the way you learn things that leave marks, that the world had opinions about a woman who carried her weight the way she did. Nearly 300 pounds settled into a frame that was just under 5.5 feet tall. Big hands that were also steady and precise. Eyes the color of creek water in autumn, a warm brown-green that noticed everything. A mouth that smiled more than it probably should have given everything she had been through. Those were things people occasionally noticed about Abigail Carter. But mostly what they noticed was her size. She had stopped being surprised by it. That was the thing nobody understood. From the outside, the surprise wore off first, and then the humiliation wore down to something duller and steadier. Something she carried the way you carry a stone in your boot. You didn't forget it was there. You just learned to walk. She had done her walking for years now. The workshop was hers completely. Every needle, every spool, every bolt of fabric she had ordered from the catalog and paid for herself. She had built this business from the $6 she saved up after her father died and the $30 she'd earned hemming dresses for the Calloway family when she was 19. She had never asked anyone for a loan she couldn't repay. She had never once been late on rent to Mr. Beaumont, who owned the building, and charged her a little more than he charged the feed store because he said the location was premium. She paid it, every month, without complaint. Because this workshop was the one thing in Willow Ridge that was entirely, undeniably hers. She was bent over a pair of heavy canvas work trousers. The Morrison Ranch had ordered 4 pairs for their hands ahead of the fall cattle drive when she heard boots on her porch steps. That happened a dozen times a day. She didn't look up from her needle. Then came the knock. 3 solid raps. Not aggressive, not uncertain. Just deliberate. Like a man who had thought about whether to knock and decided yes. "Come in," she called, not lifting her eyes from the seam. "I'll be with you in just a moment." The door opened. Cool shadow crossed the floor as it swung wide. The afternoon sun was directly behind whoever had stepped in, which meant she saw his outline first. Tall. Very tall. Broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked with their hands rather than weights. He was holding something she realized a beat later. It was his hat. He had taken it off before entering. That small thing made her look up. Men in Willow Ridge did not, as a general rule, take their hats off in her shop. They came in the way they came into the feed store, or the barber, with their hats on and their business already decided. They told her what they needed. They didn't haggle much because she was fair, and they left. That was the transaction. That was what she was to most of them. She looked up properly. I was maybe 35, she guessed, though weathered in a way that made it hard to be certain. Dust-colored hair that wanted cutting. a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. His clothes were clean, but well used, the particular kind of worn that told you a man had one good set. He kept decent, and that was it. His eyes were gray. Not the pale cold gray of overcast winter sky, but the gray of river stones polished by years of current, with some warmth underneath. He stood just inside the doorway and did not move any further in. "Miss Abigail Carter," he said. His voice was quiet, lower than she expected from someone his size, and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not feel the need to fill silence with volume. "That's me," she said carefully. Her needle had gone still between her fingers. "My name is Nathan Walker." He paused as though giving her time to place the name. When nothing crossed her face, he continued. "Your sister sent me." The needle dropped. It bounced once off the workbench and fell to the floor with a small bright sound, and Abigail didn't move to pick it up. She sat very still and looked at this man, this stranger with the gray stone eyes and the hat in his hands, and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "My sister," she repeated. "Emma Carter, out of Bozeman." He said it plainly, watching her face. "She wrote to me about 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks. Emma had been writing to this man for 6 weeks and had not said a single word. Abigail pressed her lips together and set down the canvas trousers. She stood up from her stool, and she was aware, the way she was always aware in front of strangers, of how that looked. The full rising of her. The space she occupied. She kept her chin level and her shoulders back the way she had trained herself to stand, because she had learned long ago that the only thing worse than how people looked at her was giving them the satisfaction of seeing her hide. "You have a letter," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and drew out an envelope slightly creased from travel, but sealed. He crossed to the workbench and set it down without pressing it toward her. Just placed it within reach and stepped back. She didn't touch it yet. "Mr. Walker," she said, and her voice was steady because she had had a great deal of practice keeping it that way. "Before I read that, I want you to tell me what you know. In your own words. What exactly did my sister tell you?" He considered that for a moment. Then he pulled the stool out from the corner, her consultation stool, the one she kept for customers who needed to sit while she pinned, and without asking, without the performative politeness of waiting for permission, he simply sat down. Level with her now instead of towering. That too was not what she expected. "She told me you were the finest seamstress in 3 counties, he said. "She told me you had built your business from nothing, and that you were honest, and that you were kind, and that you worked harder than most men she'd ever met." He paused. "She told me you had been hurt by someone who didn't deserve you. And she told me you were lonely." The last word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Abigail felt the ripple of it move through her from her sternum outward. She kept her face exactly where it was. "And what," she said quietly, "did she ask you to do about that?" "She asked me to come meet you." He said it without apology, without a hint of embarrassment. "That was all. She wasn't asking me to marry you or court you or rescue you from anything. She just said, come to Willow Ridge, knock on her door, introduce yourself, and see what happens." "And you did?" "I did." Abigail turned away from him and walked to the window. She stood with her back to the room and looked out at the dusty main road, at old Mr. Hennessy, sweeping the front of the hardware store, across the street at 2 ranch wives picking their way along the boardwalk, at the ordinary, relentless normalcy of a Thursday afternoon in a small town where everybody knew your business, and most of them had an opinion about it. She was 30 years old. She had not been courted in 5 years. Not since Thomas Briggs had stood in this very town in the church hall after Easter services, and said in front of 6 people, said it as if it were simply factual, simply a thing that needed saying, that he could not in good conscience marry a woman of her size. That it wouldn't be right. That people would talk. People already talked. That was the thing. They had talked before Thomas, and they had talked after, and they were going to talk now, because in a town this small, a stranger arriving and going directly to Abigail Carter's shop was going to mean something to everybody by sundown. She pressed 2 fingers against the window frame and thought very carefully about what she wanted to say. "Mr. Walker," she said at last. "Nathan," he said quietly. "Please." She turned around. He was watching her with those gray eyes, Not the way men usually looked at her with the sideways assessment, the quick read followed by the deliberate looking away, but directly, fully. The way you looked at a person you were paying attention to. It made her feel exposed and something else at the same time. Something she hadn't felt in a long time and didn't quite have a word for anymore. "Nathan," she said, and his name was strange in her mouth, the name of a stranger. "I appreciate you being honest with me, and I'm going to be honest right back." She folded her hands in front of her because it was something to do with them. "Whatever Emma told you about me, she meant well. She always means well. But she is my older sister, not my keeper, and she does not have the right to write to men on my behalf. I am not a problem to be solved. I am not a charity case. I am not something broken that needs a man to come fix it." "No," he said simply. "You're not." She stopped. He hadn't argued, hadn't softened it or qualified it or offered some gentle version of the same tired idea. He just agreed with her, quickly and completely. "I didn't come here to fix you," he said. "I came because a woman I've never met wrote me a letter and said her sister deserved someone who would see her clearly. And I was curious enough to find out if that was true." "Curious," she repeated. Something like a smile crossed his mouth. It didn't ask for anything that near smile. It wasn't trying to charm her. "I've been called worse motivations." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the letter. She didn't open it right away. She held it in both hands, felt the weight of it, which wasn't much, just a single page folded into an envelope, and thought about Emma. Emma, with her quick hands and her quick opinions, and the way she had always, from the time they were girls, decided that she knew what was best for Abigail without once thinking to ask. Emma, who had held her while she cried after Thomas Briggs, who had said all the right things, who had then apparently turned around 6 weeks later and started writing to strangers. Part of her wanted to be furious. A larger part of her, the part she trusted less these days, was the part that remembered being 18 and sitting on a fence post with Emma at sunset. Both of them talking about the lives they were going to have, the homes, and the laughter, and the somebody to share it all with. She opened the letter. Emma's handwriting was small, and even the handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship properly and practiced it. "Abigail," she had started it without any other greeting. "I know you're going to be angry. Go ahead and be angry. But I want you to do one thing first, and that is to look at this man. Really look at him before you throw him out. I have spoken with Nathan Walker twice at the Founders Social in Bozeman last spring, and he is one of the decent ones, Abby. I know you don't believe those exist anymore. I know Thomas broke something that I don't have the power to fix. But Nathan Walker is quiet and honest, and he has been building toward something good his whole life, and when I told him about you, he did not flinch. He did not look away. He asked me 2 questions. Was you kind? And were you someone who kept your word? I told him yes to both. He said he would come. Please, Abby. Give him 10 minutes. You've given less worthwhile things more of your time. Your sister who loves you even when you want to throttle her." Emma Abigail read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on the workbench. Nathan Walker had not moved from the stool. He sat with his hat resting across one knee, his hands loose, his expression neutral, not performing patience, just actually being patient, which was different. "She said you asked 2 questions," Abigail said. He nodded. "Was I kind? Was I someone who kept my word?" "That's right. That's what you wanted to know about a person. Those are the only things that matter long term," he said. "Everything else either is or isn't there from the beginning, and you don't usually have to wait long to find out." She studied him. "You're not from around here," she said. "No, ma'am. I grew up out near the Missouri Breaks. Been working ranches from Wyoming through the Dakota Territory the last several years." He paused. "I'm looking to settle. I've got land in mind about 12 miles northwest of town, up toward the higher elevation. Good grass, good water." "You've already been out to look at it?" "Twice." "You were already planning on coming to Willow Ridge," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "Before Emma wrote to you." Something shifted slightly in his expression, the nearest thing to surprise she had seen from him. "That's true," he said. "The land came first. Emma's letter came after. I won't pretend otherwise. But you still came to my door. I still came to your door, he confirmed. Because even if the timing was convenient, that doesn't make the reason less real. Abigail stood very still and listened to that. She had been lied to before, and she had a calibrated sense for it. The slight over-smoothness of a man's voice when he was saying something. He'd prepared the way the eyes slid a half-second before they should, if the words were true. Thomas Briggs had never quite met her eyes when he said he loved her. She had noticed and told herself it didn't mean anything because she had wanted it not to mean anything. Nathan Walker met her eyes directly. 10 minutes, she said. He blinked, just once. That's what Emma said I should give you, Abigail said. 10 minutes. She moved to the opposite side of the workbench, put a clean professional distance between them, and picked up her scissors, not as a threat, but as an anchor, something to hold. So talk, Nathan Walker. Tell me something true. He looked at her for a moment with those Riverstone eyes. I was engaged once, he said. 8 years ago. She was a good woman. She left because I was away too much working ranches that weren't mine, chasing a stake I didn't have yet. She wasn't wrong to go. I was too stubborn to give her anything solid to stay for. He turned his hat brim slowly between his fingers. I'm not looking to repeat that. Is that why you're settling? Partly. Mostly because I've been working toward something my whole life, and I'm tired of working toward it alone. He paused. I'm not asking you anything today, Miss Carter. I'm just introducing myself. Emma told you I was fat, Abigail said. She said it flat and direct the way she'd learned to say it. Take the word yourself. Say it before they can remove its power by using it first. She watched his face for the flinch. He didn't flinch. She told me you were a large woman, he said. Yes. And that didn't change your mind about coming. If it had, he said simply, I wouldn't be sitting here. She looked at him for a long time. Then she set down the scissors. There's a diner 2 doors down, she said. They make a decent pie. I have work I need to finish today, so I can't go now. But if you're still in Willow Ridge tomorrow morning and you want to have coffee, well. She picked up the canvas trousers and found her needle. You know where my shop is? The near smile came back. Warmer this time. He stood, and he put his hat back on, settled it, the way a man settled his hat when he was comfortable, not the hurried shove of someone heading out the door. He walked to the door, put his hand on the frame. Miss Carter, he said. Thank you for the 10 minutes. You've got about 6 left, she said without looking up from her stitching. She heard him laugh, a short, quiet sound, genuine. And then the door opened, and the summer heat came back in, and then the door closed, and he was gone. Abigail sat alone in her workshop. Her hands were moving on the canvas, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere it had not been in a very long time. Somewhere it had locked the door on and told itself it was done with. She could feel the letter on the workbench without looking at it. Could feel the shape of the last 20 minutes sitting in the air around her, the way a sound sits in a room after it stops. She had given a stranger 6 of her 10 minutes. She had offered him coffee. She had not slammed the door. Her hand stopped on the canvas. Emma, she said quietly to the empty room. I swear to God. But the thing was, and she would not say this out loud, would not admit it to anyone, including herself for quite some time. The thing was that Emma wasn't wrong. That was the infuriating part. The man had sat on her consultation stool and looked at her directly and said things that were too plain to be practiced, and now he was gone, and the room felt different from how it had felt this morning. Not better necessarily, just different, like something had shifted slightly on its axis. She didn't trust it. She picked up her needle again and went back to work. Nathan Walker found himself a room at the Calloway boarding house before sundown that evening. Mrs. Calloway was 63 and had opinions about everything which she shared freely. New in town, she said, not as a question, when he stepped onto her porch with his saddlebags. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman with white hair coiled neat at the back of her head, and she looked him over, the way a rancher looks over a horse at auction. Just arrived today, he said. What brings you to Willow Ridge? Land, he said. There's a parcel northwest of town I've had my eye on, and I want to spend some time in the area before I commit. Northwest. she considered. The old Hargrove property. That's the one. She nodded slowly. Good land, bad history. Hargrove died owing debts his son scattered to Colorado, and it's been sitting idle 3 years. She peered at him. You've got enough to buy it outright. He met her gaze. I do. She stepped back to let him in. $3 a week, breakfast included. You cause trouble, you leave. You bring liquor onto my porch, you leave. You disrespect any of my other guests, you leave. Understood, he said. She showed him to a small room at the back of the house, clean plain, a window that faced east for the morning light. He sat on the edge of the bed after she left and listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening. Horses, voices, the distant hammer of someone working late at the livery. He thought about Abigail Carter. He had not known what to expect coming here. He had read Emma's letter 4 times, and what had struck him most was not the description of her sister's looks, or her weight, or her loneliness, but the line that said she built everything herself, and she doesn't know how to let anyone help carry it. That line had stuck with him. He knew something about that. He had been carrying his own particular weight alone long enough to recognize the shape of it in someone else. She hadn't thrown him out. He hadn't expected that exactly. He had hoped, but he hadn't assumed. She'd offered him coffee. He pulled off his boots and set them beside the bed and lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling in the last of the evening light. He'd be at that diner tomorrow morning. 6 o'clock, the way he always was, because the habits of ranch work didn't leave you just because there was no ranch underneath you yet. He would be there, and she might come, or she might not. And either way, he was going to respect that choice absolutely. Emma Carter had written to him saying her sister deserved someone who would see her clearly. He thought about those riverstone eyes of his. Thought about sitting on that stool, and the particular way she had said, I am not a problem to be solved. Not pleading, not angry, just stating a fact she had clearly stated before to other people in other conversations, and been ignored anyway. He hadn't argued with her because she was right. She wasn't a problem. She was a person. He closed his eyes and listened to Willow Ridge settle into the dark. She did not go to the diner at 6 in the morning. She told herself it was because she had orders to finish. She told herself it was because she wasn't about to go chasing some stranger who showed up uninvited on her porch. She told herself a great many reasonable things while she sat at her workbench in the pale morning light and set 17 crooked stitches into what was supposed to be a straight seam on Mr. Morrison's canvas trousers. 17 crooked stitches. She pulled them all out. She had not slept well. Not because of dreams, she wasn't someone who dreamed much, or at least she didn't let herself remember them, but because her mind had kept returning to Nathan Walker's face. Specifically to the moment she had said the word fat out loud, flat and deliberate, and watched to see what he did with it. He'd looked at her, just looked, and said, if it had, I wouldn't be sitting here. She rethreaded her needle and tried the seam again. The bell above her door rang at 9:30. She looked up, and it was not Nathan Walker. It was Dora Hutchins, who ran the millinery 2 blocks east, and who was the most efficient distributor of information in Willow Ridge, which was a title she had held unchallenged for approximately 20 years. Dora was 48, wore excellent hats, and had the particular talent of making questions sound like statements. I hear you had a visitor yesterday, Dora said, settling herself into the consultation chair without being invited. Tall cowboy, very tall, went straight to your door. He was a customer, Abigail said, inquiring about work shirts. Dora's eyes were bright and entirely unconvinced. He took a room at Calloway's. People do. He was at the diner this morning, 6 o'clock, had breakfast by himself, read for a while, left around 8. Dora paused, asked May where the library was. Abigail's needle stopped. He asked where the library was, she said. May said he wanted books on land surveying. Dora tilted her head just slightly. Abigail, who is he? I told you. He came to inquire about work shirts. Abigail. She looked up from the seam and met Dora's gaze. Dora Hutchins was not a cruel woman. She was a gossip, which was a different thing, and she had never been deliberately unkind to Abigail, which in Willow Ridge put her in a relatively small category. But she was relentless, and she was already constructing a story, and whatever story Dora constructed would be the one the town heard first. "His name is Nathan Walker," Abigail said. "He's looking at the Hargrove property. He came through a mutual acquaintance." She kept her voice entirely neutral. "That is all I know about him." Dora looked at her for a long moment. "He's handsome," she said, as though this were important information Abigail might have missed. "I noticed he was tall." "Abigail." Dora leaned forward slightly. "When's the last time you let yourself—" "Dora." Abigail said it quietly and firmly. "I have 4 orders due by Friday. I appreciate you stopping by." Dora stood adjusting her hat. She looked at Abigail with something that was genuinely affectionate underneath the nosiness, something that looked almost like worry. "You deserve good things," she said. "I know you think otherwise, but you do." She left. Abigail sat with the seam in her hands and the empty shop around her and the morning sun coming through the window, and did not let herself think about land surveying books. She did not think about them for the rest of the morning. She thought about them extensively from noon until 3, while she finished the Morrison trousers and cut the pattern for Mrs. Ellery's winter coat. At 3:15, she put down her shears. She went to the diner. Nathan Walker was there. He was sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee and 3 books open around him. Actual books with pages marked. One of them spread flat with a coffee cup holding it open, and the other 2 stacked beside him. He didn't look up when she came in, which meant he hadn't seen her yet, which meant she had about 4 seconds to either turn around or commit. She committed. She sat down 2 stools over from him, and May appeared immediately from the kitchen, because nothing in Willow Ridge happened without May knowing about it within the same 60 seconds. "Coffee," Abigail said. "And whatever pie is fresh." "Rhubarb," said May and disappeared. Nathan looked up from his book. He looked at her for one moment, just a moment, the briefest unguarded thing, and then something that was not quite a smile did something around his eyes. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Walker." She settled her hands in her lap. "I see you found the library." "I did." He glanced at the books. "Land surveying is drier than I remembered." "Why are you reading about surveying? You said you've looked at the property twice." "Looking and measuring are different things." He turned one of the books slightly toward her, a page full of topographical notations that looked like the work of someone determined to understand something complicated. "The elevation changes on the north pasture are going to affect drainage. I want to know what I'm buying before I sign." She looked at the page, then back at him. "You take your time with things," she said. "Most things worth having take time," he said simply. May came back with the coffee and the pie. Abigail wrapped her hands around the coffee mug and looked at the counter in front of her for a moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. She felt him go still beside her. "You were at the diner this morning," she said. 6 o'clock, I'd imagine, based on nothing." 6:15, he said. I walked slow. The corner of her mouth moved. "I said I might come for coffee and then I didn't." "You don't owe me anything, Miss Carter. My name is Abigail," she said. "You told me yours. That's fair." The stillness in him shifted to something that was the closest thing she'd seen to him, being uncertain, a very slight thing gone, almost before she registered it. "Abigail," he said, as though he was trying out the sound of it. She took a sip of coffee. "Tell me something else true," she said. "The way you did yesterday." He was quiet for a moment, turned his coffee cup once on the counter. "I have been lonely for a long time," he said finally, the same plain way he'd said everything else. Not in the way that's dramatic, just in the daily way. The way where you sit at supper and there's no one to tell about what happened. The way where something funny occurs to you and you look around and there's nobody there. He paused. "I got good at not noticing it after a while, but I never stopped noticing it completely." Abigail was quiet. "That kind of lonely is the worst kind," she said at last without looking at him. "Because it's quiet enough that other people think you're fine." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." They sat at that counter in May's diner in the full middle of the afternoon, with the town of Willow Ridge moving outside the window, and they drank their coffee, and Abigail ate her pie, and Nathan Walker eventually closed his surveying books. They talked haltingly at first, and then less so, and then with the increasing ease of two people who had each spent a long time guarding their words, discovering that the other person was not going to use them as ammunition. She told him about her business. Not the way she usually talked about it, the brief professional summary she gave to customers, but the real version. How it had started. What she had had to fight to make it work. The specific pleasure of solving a hard alteration problem, of looking at a piece of fabric that seemed impossible, and finding the cut that made it behave. He listened the way she hadn't been listened to in years. Not waiting for his turn to speak. Actually listening. He told her about the land. About standing on the north slope 3 weeks ago in the early morning with the grass moving and the mountains behind it, and knowing the way, you just sometimes knew things, that this was where he was supposed to be. "What made you think about a family?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out before she could stop it. He looked at her directly. "I've been building toward something. It took me a long time to understand that building toward something alone is just construction. It's not a home. A home needs people in it." She looked back at her coffee. "Some people don't get homes," she said quietly. "That's a lie somebody told you," he said. "And you believed it because you heard it enough times." Her head came up. He met her gaze steadily and without apology. "I am sorry that somebody said that to you," he said. "Or enough somebodies that it stuck. I don't know the whole story, and I'm not asking for it today. But I know a lie that somebody's been living with too long when I hear one." She stared at him. She felt something in her chest that was hot and uncomfortable, and also at the very bottom of it, something she did not want to name yet, because naming it made it real, and real things could be taken from you. "It's getting late," she said. "I have orders to finish." "Of course." He gathered his books unhurried, no sign that he'd pushed too far or regretted anything he'd said. He settled up with May, left a coin on the counter that was slightly more than the coffee cost, and turned toward the door. "Nathan," she said. He stopped. "If you're still here Sunday," she said, keeping her eyes on her coffee cup. "There's a community supper after church, in the square. You'd be welcome to come." A pause. "I'll be here Sunday," he said. She heard the door open. She heard it close. May appeared from the kitchen with a look on her face that Abigail refused to acknowledge. "Don't," Abigail said. "I didn't say a word," said May. "Don't," Abigail said again. She finished her pie. Outside, the main road of Willow Ridge was full of the ordinary business of a Thursday afternoon, wagons and horses, and people with places to be and things to carry. Somewhere a few doors down, Nathan Walker was walking back toward Calloway's with his land surveying books under his arm. Abigail put 50 cents on the counter, straightened her shoulders, and walked back to her shop. The Morrison trousers were waiting. The letter from Emma was still on the workbench. She did not throw it away. The Sunday supper happened the way small-town events always happened in Willow Ridge, with too much food, too many opinions, and everyone watching everyone else while pretending not to. Abigail arrived alone. She always arrived alone. She carried a deep dish of corn pudding she'd made Saturday night, and she wore her good blue dress, the one she'd sewn herself 3 summers ago from fabric she'd ordered out of the catalog, specifically because the color was right. She had taken care with her hair. She told herself it had nothing to do with anything in particular. She spotted Nathan Walker before he spotted her. How was standing at the edge of the gathered tables, talking to old Porter Hayes, who owned the largest cattle operation east of Willow Ridge, and who talked to precisely nobody he didn't consider worth his time. Porter Hayes was laughing. Not his polite laugh, not his social laugh, but the real one. The one that came from somewhere behind his sternum and surprised him when it arrived. Abigail stood still for a moment and just watched that. Then Nathan turned his head, and he found her across the square. The way you found something you'd been keeping track of without admitting it, and he tipped his hat. Just that. A simple tip of the hat. Clean, unhurried, like punctuation. She lifted her chin once in acknowledgement and went to put her corn pudding on the food table. Dora Hutchins materialized at her elbow approximately 4 seconds later. "He came," Dora said, not bothering with a greeting. "A lot of people came," Abigail said. "It's a community supper. He's been here since 4:15, helped set up the tables. Dora's voice had the careful brightness of someone delivering important intelligence. He also fixed the leg on the Hendersons' folding table, the one that's been wobbly for 2 years. Just pulled out a pocket knife and fixed it. Dora. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. He's been asking about you, Dora said. Her voice dropped just slightly. Not to me, to Porter Hayes. Asked him how long you'd had your business, how well you were known in the county. She paused. Porter said he talked about you the way a man talks about something he's already decided to take seriously. Abigail set down the corn pudding and turned to look at Dora fully. He talked to Porter Hayes about me. Porter's the one who told me, Dora said. And Porter Hayes has not voluntarily mentioned your name once in the 14 years I've known him, so you tell me what that means. It meant Nathan Walker had spent part of his Sunday afternoon asking the most respected cattleman in the county about a seamstress. Before the supper. Before she arrived. Before there was any social reason to bring her up. She picked up her serving spoon and turned back to the table and arranged the corn pudding more carefully than it needed. He fixed the table, she said. Wobbly for 2 years, Dora confirmed, and then had the sense to walk away. Nathan Walker came to find her 20 minutes into the meal. He carried 2 plates, one his one for her already served, and he didn't ask whether she wanted him to sit down. He just sat, which might have been presumptuous, except that the way he did it was somehow simply practical, as if sitting was the reasonable next step, given that they were both there, and it was supper. You brought corn pudding, he said. How do you know it's mine? Porter Hayes told me to make sure I tried it. He looked at her with the calm amusement that she was beginning to recognize as his version of being impressed. He said you were the only person in 3 counties who made it right. Porter Hayes has never once said that to my face. Porter Hayes isn't someone who says things to faces, Nathan said. He says them after. She looked down at the plate he'd served her. He'd gotten proportions right, not a delicate performative little plate, the way people sometimes served her when they were making a point about her size, and not an aggressive overloading either. Just a normal plate. The plate of someone who hadn't spent a single second thinking about it. That small thing hit her somewhere quiet. She picked up her fork. They ate and they talked, and around them, the community supper went on with its ordinary noise and motion. At the far end of the tables, Reverend Moore was deep in debate with Doc Patterson about the county water rights. 3 ranch wives were coordinating something involving the Fall Harvest Festival. Children were running in patterns that had no logic except speed, and Abigail Carter was sitting at a community supper with a man beside her, which had not happened in a very long time. She was aware of the watching. She was always aware of the watching, the particular quality of attention that fell on her from certain directions, the angle of a turned head, the way a conversation would pause and then resume at a different pitch. She had learned to keep her posture and her face neutral through it, to not give it the satisfaction of a reaction. Nathan ate his supper and appeared completely unconscious of it all. You're not from a small town, she said. What makes you say that? You don't notice the watching, she said. People who grew up in small towns know how to feel it. He glanced up from his plate, looked around the square once briefly, then back at her. I noticed, he said. I just don't much care. It's easy not to care when they're watching you, she said. Not bitter, just factual. It's different when they've been watching you for years, and you know what they're deciding. He was quiet for a moment. What are they deciding? He said. She looked at him steadily. That you're either naive or peculiar. That any decent-looking man who sits down to supper with Abigail Carter must not know what he's getting into, or that he wants something from her he can get cheaper somewhere else. She kept her voice even. I've heard all of them, versions of all of them. And what do you think I'm doing? He asked. Honest answer. She considered him. The gray eyes level, the question genuine, no performance in it. I think you're a man who made a long ride on the word of a letter, she said finally, and I'm not entirely sure yet whether that makes you principled or just stubborn. The near smile. Could be both, he said. Could be, she agreed. 2 tables over, she heard it. The particular lowering of a voice that meant something was being said that the speaker didn't want to project, but also didn't much care who overheard. Clara Wilson, whose husband owned the hardware store, leaning toward Helen Marsh, whose husband did not own anything in particular, but who had opinions that made up for it. "I give it 2 weeks," Clara said. "He'll figure it out soon enough." Abigail's fork stilled on her plate. She had told herself so many times that she was past this. Past the hot rush of it, past the way it lodged somewhere between her ribs and stayed there burning. She had told herself she was made of tougher material than that. Most days, she believed it. Today, with Nathan Walker sitting beside her, it was worse than usual. Because it wasn't just herself she was carrying it for. It was the fresh awareness that anyone who sat next to her became a target of it too, and she had no right to make that somebody else's burden. She set down her fork. Nathan had gone very still. "You heard that," she said. "Yes," he said. "You don't have to she, Abigail." He said her name quietly, the way he said everything. "Don't tell me what I don't have to do." She looked at him. He was looking across the square toward Clara Wilson with an expression that was not angry. It was the expression of a man doing a very calm calculation. Then he turned back to Abigail and picked up his fork again. "Tell me about the Morrison Ranch," he said. "Porter mentioned they're the biggest order you run on a regular basis." She stared at him. "You want to talk about the Morrison Ranch. I want to talk about your work," he said simply. "You were telling me the other day about hard alterations. What's the hardest order you've ever had to fill?" For a moment she couldn't speak. Not because she didn't have an answer. She had a very specific answer. The Callaway wedding dress 4 years ago. The one with 17 individual panels, and a client who changed her mind about the neckline 3 times. That was the hardest order. She knew it without thinking. What she couldn't do for a moment was process the fact that he had deliberately, calmly, completely redirected the conversation toward her expertise, toward the thing she was good at, toward the version of herself that nobody in this square ever asked about. "The Callaway wedding dress," she said. 4 years ago." "Tell me about it," he said. And she did. By the time the supper wound down, and people began drifting toward their wagons and their evening chores. Abigail had been talking. Really talking the way she talked in her head, but rarely out loud for the better part of an hour. Nathan Walker asked questions that were specific and genuine, and she answered them specifically and genuinely. And at no point did he look at her the way people looked at her when they were being politely interested while waiting for her to finish. How was interested? Just interested. The straightforward, inconvenient fact of it. She helped clear tables. So did he, without being asked, stacking chairs and carrying things to the church hall, with the ease of a man who had spent his life being useful wherever he happened to be. Reverend Moore thanked him by name, which meant someone had introduced them, which meant Nathan Walker had taken the time to introduce himself to the Reverend before the supper started. She stood beside the now empty food table and looked at him across the square, watched him carry the last folding table to the church hall door. And she thought against her will and better judgment. Emma wasn't wrong. The thought scared her badly enough that she picked up her empty corn pudding dish and started walking home. He caught up with her at the corner of the main road. Not running. Just long-legged and unhurried, covering ground the way he did everything else. "I'll walk you," he said. "I'm 2 blocks." "I know." She didn't tell him not to. They walked the 2 blocks in the warm evening, the last light going orange over the rooftops, and he didn't try to fill the quiet with talking. She had noticed that about him, the places where other people would have rushed to speak, he simply didn't. The silences weren't uncomfortable. They were just spaces. She was unused to silences that didn't demand anything from her. At the door of her workshop, she stopped. "Nathan," she said. "Abigail." "What Clara Wilson said tonight." She kept her eyes on the door. "That's not going to stop. That's just how it is here. How it's always been here for me. I want you to know that before you decide to keep sitting down to supper next to me." A pause. "Are you trying to warn me off?" he said. "I'm trying to be honest with you." "All right," he said. "Then I'll be honest back." He waited until she turned to look at him. I have spent 8 years working ranches from Wyoming to the Missouri breaks. I have slept on frozen ground. I have pulled cattle out of flooded draws at 3 in the morning. I have dealt with rustlers and bad weather and 3 different employers who shorted my wages and hoped I wouldn't notice. He held her gaze steadily. Clara Wilson is not a serious problem. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a stubborn man, she said. Principled, he said. You said so yourself. She turned back to her door, put her hand on the latch. Good night, Nathan, she said. Good night, Abigail. She went inside. She put the corn pudding dish in the wash basin, lit the lamp, sat down at her workbench, not because there was work to do at this hour, but because sitting at her workbench was where she thought. She sat for a long time. Then she got out her order book and wrote down the measurements for the Ellery winter coat, which she had been meaning to record for 3 days, and she worked until the lamp needed refilling, and she did not once think about the way Nathan Walker had said, "I'm just not done yet." She thought about it continuously for the entire time she was supposedly not thinking about it. He came into her shop the following Wednesday afternoon. She heard the door and looked up, expecting a customer, and found him standing in the entry with 2 shirts in his hands. Both of them. His, she could tell by the size and a look on his face, of a man with a straightforward purpose. These need mending, he said. The collar on this one's going, and this one here has a seam let loose in the shoulder. He set them on her counter. I'll pay your regular rate. She looked at the shirts. Both of them were quality cotton, well made, worn with real use. The collar on the first was indeed starting to fray. The shoulder seam on the second had pulled about 2 inches. These are both fixable, she said. I assumed. Some men would just buy new shirts. Some men don't mend things that can be mended, he said. I'm not one of those men. She picked up the shoulder seam shirt and examined the pull. I can have these done by Friday. No rush, he said. I've got work through the rest of the week. I'm helping the Hendersons fix up their back fence line cattle kept getting into the east pasture. She glanced up. Earl Henderson has had that fence problem for 2 years. I know. He mentioned it. I offered. He shrugged slightly, the uncomplicated shrug of someone who saw a thing that needed doing and did it. He tried to pay me, and I told him not to worry about it. Abigail set the shirt down. Why? She said. He looked at her. Why not? He said. Because people don't do things like that without expecting something back. Not around here. Maybe not anywhere. Some people do, he said. I try to be one of them. She studied him. He stood at her counter looking perfectly comfortable with her scrutiny, which itself was unusual. Most people, when Abigail really looked at them, shifted. They didn't like being looked at too closely by her for reasons she had never fully worked out, whether it was her size, her directness, or some combination of both. Nathan Walker stood still under her looking and waited. Come back Friday, she said. The shirts will be ready. He picked up his hat from the counter. I'll bring payment. My rate for a collar repair is 30 cents. Shoulder seam is 25. Don't try to overpay me. The near smile. I wouldn't dream of it, he said. He came back Friday. The shirts were folded neatly on the counter. She had done the collar repair with near-invisible stitching, the kind of work that took longer, but that she always did anyway, because she was incapable of doing anything at less than her full capability. She had also reinforced the other shoulder seam preemptively, because once one went, the other usually followed. He picked up the shirts and examined them with the careful attention of someone who knew what good work looked like. You reinforced the other shoulder, he said. You would have been back in a month otherwise. He looked up from the shirt. The expression on his face was something she couldn't entirely categorize, a kind of pleased surprise mixed with something more considered. Nobody's ever done that before, he said. Just fixed the thing that wasn't broken yet. It was going to be broken, she said. I know, but nobody ever bothered to see it before it was. He set the coins on the counter exact the right amount, no more and no less, just as she'd asked. And then he reached into his jacket pocket and set a small paper package beside the coins. What's that? She said. Thread, he said. I noticed you were running low on the brown. Morrison brown, closest match to the canvas you're using on those ranch orders. He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without ceremony. I was at the dry goods store this morning anyway. Seemed practical. Abigail looked at the thread. She looked at it for a moment that was probably longer than it needed to be. He had noticed what thread she was using on an order she hadn't mentioned to him. He had gone to the dry goods store. He had bought thread that matched the specific shade she needed. "How did you know which brown?" she said. "I pay attention," he said simply. She picked up the thread. The shade was exactly right, close enough to be a perfect match for the Morrison canvas. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You said your rate. I paid your rate." He settled his hat. "The thread isn't payment for anything. It's just thread." She looked up at him. "Most people would have made that into something." "I'm not most people," he said, not arrogantly. Just as a fact he seemed settled with. He left. Abigail held the thread in her palm for a moment after the door closed. The bell above it had barely finished ringing. Then she put the thread in her supply drawer, picked up the Morrison trousers, and went back to work. The problem was that the town was watching. Not all of it, and not always in the mean way. Some of it was genuine curiosity, the ordinary human interest of a small community, tracking a new development. But some of it was the other kind, and it was the other kind that found its ways to reach her. It was Hattie Graves who started it as near as Abigail could trace it later. Hattie was 61 and kept a meticulous vegetable garden, and had never once said anything kind to anyone that Abigail could recall. She caught Abigail coming out of the post office on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Nathan had first knocked on her door, and she planted herself directly in Abigail's path the way she'd clearly been waiting to do. "I hear that Cowboy's been spending considerable time around your shop," Hattie said. No greeting, just straight to it. "He's a customer," Abigail said and tried to move past. "He bought thread for you at Henderson's Dry Goods," Hattie said. "That's not the kind of thing customers do." Abigail stopped. "He's also been seen walking you home twice." Hattie continued with the satisfaction of someone who had been taking careful inventory. "And sitting with you at the founder's supper, and having coffee at May's on 3 separate occasions." "He's a grown man," Abigail said. "He makes his own choices." "He doesn't know this town," Hattie said. "He's new. He doesn't understand." She stopped, clearly choosing her next words, and what she settled on was, "He doesn't understand the situation." What situation would that be? Hattie? Hattie's chin went up slightly. "He's a healthy-looking man, could have any number of women. He's going to realize that eventually, and when he does..." She let the sentence hang unfinished, which was worse than finishing it. Abigail felt the familiar heat move through her, the burn of it low in her chest. "Thank you for your concern," she said, and stepped around Hattie Graves with her head level, her back straight, and her hands steady at her sides. She walked to her shop, went inside, locked the door behind her, and stood with her back against it for approximately 45 seconds. Then she unlocked the door, because she had a business to run, and sat down at her workbench. The encounter with Hattie Graves was not the worst of it. The worst of it came 4 days later on a Saturday when Abigail stopped at Henderson's Dry Goods for pearl buttons she'd ordered, and found herself standing 3 feet from Chester Pollard and his ranch foreman, who were apparently too busy loading supplies to notice she was there, or who didn't much care. "That Walker fellow," Chester said to his foreman with the conversational ease of a man who had no idea he was being heard. "Been sniffing around the Carter woman, something considerable." The foreman grunted. "Don't know what he's after," Chester continued. "Girl like that can't have much saved up. Maybe he figures she's desperate enough to cook and clean without complaint." He laughed at his own observation, a short dismissive sound. "Men have done worse calculations." Abigail stood very still at the button counter. May Henderson behind the dry goods counter had gone very carefully busy arranging things that didn't need arranging. She had heard it. She was choosing not to react, which was her way of surviving in a town where Chester Pollard bought a great deal of supplies. Abigail put her coins on the counter for the buttons, took her parcel, and walked out. She was halfway down the block when she heard Nathan's voice. "Abigail." She turned. He was coming from the direction of the livery, and he had clearly just arrived because he was still rolling down his shirt sleeves from working. He read her face in approximately half a second. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," she said. Nothing that doesn't happen regularly. He waited. She looked up at him. She could see Henderson's dry goods from where they stood and the shape of Chester Pollard moving around inside. Chester Pollard has a theory about why you're spending time with me, she said. It involves the word desperate and a calculation about what I can offer a man who's thinking practically. Something went through Nathan Walker's face. Not anger exactly, not the hot visible kind. Something quieter and more settled, the kind of feeling that had somewhere definite it planned to go. Walk with me, he said. Nathan. Not to do anything, he said. Just walk with me. She walked with him. They went up the main road and turned onto the side street that ran behind the livery where there wasn't foot traffic, and he stopped and turned to face her with his hands at his sides. I want to say something to you, he said, and I want you to hear it plainly. All right. I know what this town thinks, he said. I've been here 3 weeks. I'm not oblivious. I know they think I don't understand what I'm doing. I know they think I'll come to my senses. He looked at her steadily, those gray stone eyes absolutely level. I want you to hear this once, and I'm not going to repeat it unless you ask me to. I am not here because I made a calculation. I am not here because I think you're desperate or convenient or some kind of useful arrangement. I am here because I met you, and I think you are worth knowing, and every day I've spent in this town has confirmed that. He paused. That's all. That's the whole of it. Abigail stood very still. She had learned a long time ago, out of sheer survival, not to let herself want things too much, not to let her face do too much, not to let the inside of her chest get too loud. She wanted to believe him. That was the terrifying part. She wanted to believe him with the specific dangerous want of a person who had stopped believing things and then found something worth believing again. You're a stubborn man, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. You've mentioned that. I'm going to keep being difficult, she said. I'm not going to make this easy just because you say the right things. I know, he said. I'm not asking for easy. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and started walking back toward the main road. I have buttons to sort, she said. Come have coffee at May's this afternoon if you want. 4 o'clock. She heard him fall into step beside her. 4 o'clock, he said. They were becoming a regular sight at May's diner. Abigail knew it and chose not to address it because addressing it meant making it a more official thing than she was ready to make it, and also because the coffee was genuinely good and the pie was better, and she had spent enough years eating her meals alone that she was unwilling to sacrifice a decent afternoon on principle. Nathan was working steadily through the ranching community. Porter Hayes had put him to work permanently, not as a hired hand exactly, but as someone Porter trusted to manage projects Hayes didn't have the time or the people for. In 3 weeks, Nathan Walker had fixed the Henderson fence, helped bring in the Morrison, early hay bale count, repaired the east water trough at the Callaway spread, and assisted Doc Patterson in getting his wagon out of a ditch that he'd driven into during the Thursday rain. He did not accept payment for most of it. He did not talk about the fact that he didn't accept payment for most of it. Abigail only knew because people told her, because it turned out that in a small town, the things a man did got reported back to the woman he was courting. Whether she called it courting or not, and whether she wanted the information or not. He fixed the Callaway trough, May said one afternoon, with the barely contained excitement of someone who had information they'd been holding all day. Saved them replacing the whole thing. Earl Callaway said it would have run $3 at least to replace. He mentioned he was out that way, Abigail said. Did he mention he wouldn't take the $2 Earl tried to give him? Abigail was quiet. He told Earl to put it toward the Harvest Festival Fund, May said. That's what I heard. Abigail drank her coffee. The thing about Nathan Walker that she was slowly, reluctantly, carefully beginning to understand was that he didn't perform his goodness. It wasn't the goodness of a man who wanted to be seen being good. It was the goodness of a man who had decided a long time ago what kind of person he was going to be, and then simply was that person. Consistently. Without announcement. She had known people who were kind because they wanted credit for it. She had known people who helped others because the debt it created was useful. She had never until Nathan Walker known someone whose decency was just structural. Load-bearing. The way a well-built wall carries weight without calling attention to itself. It scared her. Because she knew how to defend herself against men who wanted things. She did not know how to defend herself against a man who simply was what he appeared to be. She was thinking about this at her workbench on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into knowing him, the lamp burning low and the town quiet, when someone knocked on her door. It was late for a knock. Past 8. She almost didn't answer. She opened the door. It was not Nathan. It was Emma. Her sister stood on the porch with a traveling bag at her feet, and road dust on her skirt, and the particular expression of someone who has spent 4 hours on a stagecoach rehearsing a conversation and is no longer entirely sure how it begins. "I was worried about you," Emma said. Abigail looked at her sister, older by 4 years. Same Creekwater eyes, same Carter jaw, same capacity for making enormous decisions that affected other people, and not understanding why that might be complicated. "Emma," she said, "come in." Emma came in. She looked around the workshop. She always assessed a room when she entered it, filed it away, and then sat in the consultation chair and folded her hands in her lap, in the way that meant she was preparing to say something she'd prepared to say. "Did he come?" Emma asked. "He came," Abigail said. And nothing. And he's here. And he's—" She stopped, started again. "Emma, you had no right." "I know," Emma said immediately. That stopped Abigail. She had expected argument. "I know I had no right," Emma said again. "And I want you to be angry at me if you need to be. But I also want you to tell me honestly that you're not glad he came, and I want to see your face when you say it." Abigail stood very still. She thought about the thread, the exact shade of Morrison brown sitting in her supply drawer. She thought about Nathan Walker sitting on her consultation stool on the first day and saying, "I'm not asking you anything today. Miss Carter, I'm just introducing myself." She thought about the way he'd redirected the supper conversation toward the Callaway wedding dress and asked her questions about 17 individual panels, while Clara Wilson's cruelty dissolved somewhere in the general noise of the square. She looked at her sister. "I'm not going to say it," she said quietly. Emma breathed out a long, careful exhale, like she'd been holding it for weeks. "He's a good man, Abby." "I know," Abigail said. "That's not the part that worries me." "What's the part that worries you?" Abigail turned away and looked at the window. Outside, Willow Ridge was dark and quiet. The main road empty, the stars overhead, the particular thick western stars you only got in Montana in the clear, dry air of late summer. "The part that worries me," she said slowly, "is that I can feel myself starting to believe it, and I don't know how to believe something without putting all of myself into it. And the last time I put all of myself into believing something—" She stopped. "Thomas Briggs was a coward," Emma said, and her voice was harder than Abigail had heard it in years. "He was a coward and a fool, and he did not deserve one single moment of the time you gave him." "I know that," Abigail said. "Knowing it doesn't change the shape he left." The room was quiet. Emma stood up from the consultation chair and crossed to her sister and put her hands on Abigail's arms, both of them the full grip of someone who needed to be taken seriously. "Look at me," Emma said. Abigail looked. "Nathan Walker asked about you before he ever got on his horse," Emma said. "He asked me whether you were kind, whether you kept your word. He did not ask what you looked like. He did not ask your size or your appearance or whether you'd been—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, and then continued. "He asked who you were, not what you looked like. Abby, that's not nothing." Abigail stood in her sister's grip and felt the words land. She had known all of this. Some part of her had been carrying it since the first afternoon, turning it over, holding it up to the light and looking for the flaw in it, the way she looked for a flaw in a seam. She had been waiting for the catch, for the thing that would reveal the underside of it, the place where it was pretending to be something it wasn't. It hadn't come. In 31 days, it had not come. "I'm scared, Emma," she said quietly. It cost her something to say it. It always cost her something to say true things out loud. "I know," Emma said. "Being brave enough to try again is the scariest thing I know of." Abigail stood still for a moment longer. Then she put her arms around her sister and held on. Emma stayed 3 days. On the second day, Nathan Walker came by the shop and met her, a meeting that lasted approximately 10 minutes. Involved very little small talk and ended with Emma looking at Abigail afterward with an expression that was equal parts vindicated and genuinely moved. "He shook my hand," Emma said. "People shake hands," Abigail said. "He thanked me for writing the letter," Emma said. "He said, and I am quoting him exactly, 'Whatever happens, I'm grateful you trusted me with her name.' And then he asked me whether the corn pudding recipe was yours or your mother's, because he'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks." Abigail stood at her workbench with her shears in her hand. "The corn pudding," she said. "He's been thinking about it for 2 weeks," Emma confirmed. Abigail turned back to her fabric. "He's going to break my heart," she said. "Not melodramatically, just quietly, the way you said a thing you'd decided to accept." "He might," Emma said. "But Abby." She waited until her sister looked at her. "Wouldn't you rather find out?" Emma left on a Wednesday morning on the stage to Bozeman with a letter to mail from Abigail and a promise to write weekly. She hugged Abigail on the stage stop platform and whispered into her ear something that Abigail didn't answer and didn't argue with. She stood on the platform and watched the stage pull away and thought about what her sister had said. "You've been surviving for 5 years. You deserve to see what living feels like." She walked back down the main road of Willow Ridge in the August morning, past the feed store and the millinery and the church, past the spot where Hattie Graves usually positioned herself on mornings when she felt like having opinions, past May's Diner, where the breakfast rush was winding down. She walked back to her shop. She unlocked the door. She sat down at her workbench and looked at the order book and thought, for the first time in 5 years, not about survival. She thought about the north pasture of the Hargrove property, 12 miles northwest, and the way Nathan Walker had described standing there in the early morning with the mountains behind him. And she thought, what would it look like to stop running from it? She picked up her needle. She did not have an answer yet, but for the first time in a very long time, she was beginning to believe she might want one. The morning Nathan Walker asked her to ride out to the Hargrove property, Abigail almost said no. Not because she didn't want to go. That was the problem. She wanted to go considerably more than she was comfortable with, and wanting things considerably more than she was comfortable with had a history of ending badly for her. She stood in her workshop doorway with the morning light coming in behind him and thought about every good reason to decline the Morrison order, the Ellery coat pattern, the 3 alterations sitting in a basket that needed finishing by Thursday. "There'll be other mornings," she said. "There will," he agreed. "But I'm signing the purchase papers at the end of the week, and I wanted you to see it before I did." She went still. "Before you sign," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her with those gray stone eyes that never seemed to be performing anything. "Because your opinion matters to me," he said. "And because I want you to see it the way I see it. Not in paperwork, not in descriptions. In person with the morning on it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took off her work apron and hung it on the peg by the door. He had borrowed 2 horses from Porter Hayes, a steady bay for himself, and a broad-backed roan mare for Abigail, chosen with clear thought for her comfort, which she noticed and did not comment on. They rode northwest out of Willow Ridge, with the August morning spreading wide and gold around them, and Nathan talked about the land, the way he'd talked about everything from the beginning, plainly, with the specificity of a man who had thought carefully about something and was now simply sharing what he'd concluded. He told her about the water. 2 good springs on the north side of the property, reliable year-round, which was the first thing a serious rancher looked at, and the thing most people got wrong. He told her about the grass, native bunch grass on the upper slopes that came back strong every season without replanting. He told her about the timber access on the eastern ridge for building, and the shelter it provided for cattle in hard winters. He talked about all of it the way a man talked about a thing he loved, which was different from the way a man talked about a thing he wanted. Abigail listened. She asked questions about the water table and the fence line situation, and he answered without surprise at the question's specificity, because he had stopped being surprised by what she knew. 3 weeks into knowing Nathan Walker, that was one of the things she had begun to trust. He did not treat her intelligence as an unexpected bonus. When they arrived, she understood immediately why he had wanted her to see it in person. She understood it the way you understood music, not by analyzing it, but by feeling it move through you before you had time to decide what you thought. The valley opened up below the ridge they crested on horseback, green and wide, and bordered by the mountains, standing clean against the blue sky. And there were horses down in the lower pasture, wild ones, 3 of them moving in the unhurried way of animals that didn't know they were being watched. The air was different up here, clearer, the kind of air that made you breathe differently without meaning to. Nathan reined his horse beside hers and didn't say anything. He let her look. That, too, she had learned to recognize. The specific respect of a man who understood that some things needed their own time. "How much land?" she asked finally. 480 acres. 200 suitable for cattle grazing, 60 in timber, the rest in natural grassland and slope. He paused. "There's a building site on the southern side of the main meadow. Good drainage, southern exposure." She looked where he was indicating she could read land, the way she read fabric with the sense of someone who had been paying attention to things her whole life. "Southern exposure," she said. "That's good for a garden." "It's good for a lot of things," he said. He dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post, the old Hargrove fence weathered but still standing, and then without drama, without making a production of it, he reached up and offered her a hand down. She took it. She had to. The roan was taller than she usually rode, and his grip was solid and completely matter-of-fact, the hand of a man helping a person off a horse, nothing more and nothing less. They walked the property for an hour. He showed her the springs. Both of them, the north one, running cold and fast over smooth rock. The south one slower and broader, good for livestock. He showed her the building site on the southern meadow, which had been cleared at some point years ago, the ground flat and solid underfoot. He showed her the old Hargrove cabin foundation still sound, which he planned to build from, rather than starting from nothing. And then he unfolded the papers. He had been carrying them inside his jacket, hand-drawn plans on good paper, rendered with the careful precision of a man who had taught himself drafting because he needed to, and practiced it until he could do it well. The main house, the barn, the outbuildings. He spread them across a flat-topped fence post, and weighted the corners with stones, and showed her each element with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything. She studied the plans. "This room," she said. She put her finger on a room on the south side of the main house, larger than the others. A long, narrow rectangle with windows on the southern wall, a separate entry. Nathan looked at the plans, and then at her, and his voice dropped to something quiet. "It isn't a sewing room yet," he said. "It becomes one only if you choose it." The words landed in her chest with the particular weight of something said carefully. Not impulsively. Not as a performance of romance. As a simple, considered statement of a real possibility he had already built into his plans. She looked at that room on the paper. The southern windows. The separate entry so customers could come in without going through the house. He had thought about her work. Not as something she would give up. As something she would keep. Her throat was tight in a way she didn't like. "Nathan," she said, "I'm not asking you anything today." He said the same way he'd said it the first day. But it was different now, 3 weeks, and a great deal of truth between them, and they both knew it. "You drew this with that room already in it," she said. "Yes." "When 2 days after I met you," he said. She stood with the plans between her hands and the Montana morning around her and the wild horses moving somewhere below in the valley, and she felt something she hadn't felt since she was 18 years old on a fence post with Emma, talking about futures, the terrifying, inconvenient, completely unwelcome feeling of hope. Real hope. The kind that had somewhere specific to land. She was still holding the plans when she heard the horse. A single rider coming up from the south, fast pushing his horse harder than the terrain warranted coming from the direction of the main road. Nathan heard it too, and they both turned, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The rider came over the ridge and pulled up hard, and the horse danced sideways, and the dust came up, and when it settled, Abigail saw the face and felt something cold move through her from the base of her spine upward. Thomas Briggs. How was 37 now? Better dressed than she remembered, which meant he'd landed somewhere with money which she had always suspected he would. He had the kind of looks that aged into something authoritative, and he was wearing that authority the way a man wore a new coat, aware of it, pleased with it. He looked at the two of them standing by the fence post with the papers between them, and his eyes moved from Nathan to Abigail, and something crossed his face that was complicated and ugly. "Well," Thomas said, "he didn't get off his horse. I heard there was a man out here looking at the Hargrove land. I didn't know you'd be part of the showing, Abigail." Her name in his mouth was a different thing than it was in Nathan's. A smaller, flatter thing. A thing that belonged on a shelf somewhere, taken down occasionally and looked at without pleasure. "Thomas," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She had practiced this not for Thomas specifically, but for the version of him that lived in her chest and occasionally tried to speak. She had practiced steadiness against it until steadiness was the only thing her voice knew how to do. "You're looking well," he said. He said it the way you said something that wasn't quite true. Same as always. Nathan Walker had not moved, had not stepped in front of her, had not made any territorial gesture. He stood beside her with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in the specific neutral of a man deciding what something was before he decided what to do about it. "Thomas Briggs," she said to Nathan. "He used to live in Willow Ridge." "I know the name," Nathan said. Thomas's eyes moved to Nathan more carefully at that. "Walker," he said. "I've heard of you too. You've been making yourself useful around town." There was something in the tone, not quite contempt, but the near neighbor of it, the kind of thing a man said when he wanted to diminish something without appearing to. "I try to be," Nathan said simply. Thomas looked back at Abigail. "You're helping him look at the land." "He asked me to come," she said. "I came." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. The particular shift of a man recalculating who had assumed something about how this would go and was now adjusting for different conditions. "Abigail," Thomas said, and his voice changed, went lower and more intimate in a way that made her skin feel wrong. "Can I speak to you a moment privately?" "No," she said. He blinked. She had never, as far as he knew, simply said no to him. He had expected hesitation or capitulation, or the particular flustered quality she used to have in his presence when she had still been trying to deserve him. "Abigail." "I said no, Thomas." She folded the plans along their original creases the way she handled things she needed to treat carefully. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Nathan, or you can say it to no one." Thomas looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at Thomas with the complete equanimity of a man who was not impressed. "All right," Thomas said. His voice had gone harder. "I'll say it plainly. I've been in Bozeman 3 years. I'm back to settle some land business of my own, and I heard from more than one person that you'd taken up with a stranger." He paused. "A stranger who doesn't know this county, who doesn't know your history, who's going to eventually figure out that he could do considerably better." "Stop," Nathan said. His voice was quiet, not raised, not aggressive, just final the way a door closing is final. Thomas stopped. "You came up here to say something," Nathan said, "that you believed would do damage. I've watched you say it, and I want you to know that it did not land where you aimed it. And I want you to know one more thing." He looked at Thomas with those riverstone eyes and the complete settled certainty of a man who had no doubt about where he stood. "Whatever happened between you and this woman before is finished. I don't need the history, and I don't need your opinion. You can ride back down that hill, or you can stay on it. Either way, this conversation is done." Thomas stared at him. He was a man who was used to being the most certain person in a room. He was discovering that Nathan Walker was a different kind of certain, not louder, not angrier, just structurally unmovable in a way that Thomas's particular kind of certainty didn't have an answer for. Thomas looked at Abigail one more time. His face did something complicated, guilt maybe, or the shadow of it. The ghost of knowing he had done something a long time ago that he couldn't undo, and was only now standing in front of the evidence of it beginning to feel the full weight of. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said to her, not cruelly, almost quietly. "I do," she said. He turned his horse and rode back down the hill. They stood and listened to the sound of the hooves until it faded. The valley was quiet again. The wild horses had moved further east. The papers were still in her hands. Nathan said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. She meant it. She was surprised to mean it, but she did. "He was your fiancé," Nathan said. Not a question. He had known that she had guessed he probably had from the way Emma talked, from the way small towns worked. 5 years ago, she said. He left 2 weeks before the wedding, said he couldn't. She stopped. He said it wouldn't be right, in front of people, in the church hall. A silence. "I'm sorry," Nathan said. He said it the way he said true things, without decoration, without trying to fix anything with it. "I survived it," she said. "I know you did." He turned to look at her fully. "You survived it, and you built something, and you kept going, and you never let it make you small, even though it tried." He paused. "That is not a small thing, Abigail." She looked at the plans still in her hands. The southern room. The windows. And then the cold thing happened. It came from inside her, not from Thomas, not from the town, not from any external source. It came from the deep place where she kept the oldest injuries, the ones she'd thought she'd sealed over. She heard Thomas's voice the way she'd heard it in the church hall 5 years ago. The sound of it, the specific tone of a man removing himself from a responsibility he'd decided was beneath him, and she heard it laid over Nathan's voice, saying, "I never came to change you." And the two sounds were so different that the distance between them was terrifying, because here was the thing about hope. Here was the thing she had learned at 19 and relearned at 25, and was standing here at 30, relearning again in the Montana morning. With the plans in her hands, hope was not safe. Hope was the most dangerous thing she had ever let herself feel, because hope required you to believe you deserved the good thing. And she had been told by Thomas, by the town, by 5 years of silence, that she did not. She handed Nathan the plans. She handed them back carefully folded correctly, without crumpling the paper. "I need to get back," she said. "I have orders." He took the plans, looked at her. "Abigail." "I'm fine," she said. I need to get back." She walked to the roan and mounted without his help this time. And she didn't look at his face, because if she looked at his face with the southern room, and Thomas's voice still echoing, and the mountains behind him, she was going to do something she wasn't ready to do. They rode back to Willow Ridge mostly in silence. Not a hostile silence, not the silence after a fight. The silence after something large had moved through, and both parties were still figuring out what had been disturbed. At the edge of town, Nathan pulled his horse level with hers. "I'm not going to chase you," he said quietly. "That's not how I do things." She looked at him. "But I'm also not going to disappear," he said. "I'll be here when you're ready to keep talking, whether that's tomorrow or next week or—" He stopped himself. "I'll just be here." She rode back to her shop. She dismounted, tied the roan to the post outside, and went straight to her workbench and picked up the Ellery coat pattern and told herself to work. Her hands shook slightly. Just slightly. She pressed them flat against the fabric until they stopped. The problem with Nathan Walker. The specific, devastating problem was that he had not done anything wrong. Thomas Briggs had been easy in the end, even in the pain of him, because Thomas had given her something to be angry at. He had been wrong, clearly and completely, and she had been able to build something solid out of the wreckage, a wall, a certainty, a shape of self-protection that she understood the architecture of. Nathan gave her nothing to be angry at. He kept showing up with the right thread and the right questions, and the patient, unhurried attention of a man who was genuinely interested, and every day it was harder to find the flaw in it, and every day the fact that she couldn't find the flaw scared her more than finding one would have. She was on her third pass at the Ellery coat pattern, making adjustments she'd already made when the door opened, and it wasn't Nathan. It was Dora Hutchins, who came in the way she always came in, which was the way weather came in, without particular announcement, as a natural condition. "Thomas Briggs is in town," Dora said. "I know," Abigail said. "I saw him." Dora stopped. "You saw him?" "He rode out to the Hargrove property while Nathan and I were there." The quality of Dora's silence was very particular. The silence of someone assembling a great deal of information and deciding how to present it. How was that? Dora said carefully. Instructive, Abigail said. Did he? Dora started and then stopped herself, which was unusual for Dora. She tried again. Are you all right, Abigail? The question had the genuine quality that Dora's questions occasionally surprised her with. Underneath the nosiness, underneath the information. Gathering there was something real in Dora Hutchins that came out sideways, sometimes unexpectedly. I don't know yet, Abigail said honestly. Dora sat down in the consultation chair. He's staying at the Pollard place, she said. Thomas, Chester Pollard's wife, is his cousin. He's apparently here for a week or two on some land business. A week or two? What kind of land business? Abigail said. Something about the parcel east of the river. His family had an old claim. Dora paused. Abigail. He was asking about you. In town this morning before he rode out. I was asking about your shop, whether anyone had come calling on you. Abigail set down the pattern. He was asking about me, she said flatly. More than once, Dora said. Hattie Graves told him about Nathan. I'm sorry, I know she shouldn't have, but you know Hattie. She framed it as concerned, but she was pleased to be telling him, and that came through. Abigail was quiet. He rode out there on purpose, she said. Not to Dora, to herself, saying it out loud to hear it properly. It looks like it, Dora said carefully. She sat with that. Thomas Briggs, who had left her in a church hall in front of witnesses, had ridden out to the Hargrove property specifically to interrupt something between her and Nathan Walker. That was what had happened. She had been so occupied with managing her own reaction that she hadn't fully assembled it until now. He had not come back to apologize. He had not come back to make amends. He had come back because someone had told him there was a man in her life, and something in Thomas Briggs had decided that was information requiring his response. The anger when it came was clean. Cleaner than she expected. Cleaner than the old grief, cleaner than the fear. It was a clear, cold anger, the anger of a woman who understood exactly what had just been done to her and had no patience left for it. Thank you, Dora, she said, for telling me. Dora looked at her. What are you going to do? I'm going to finish the Ellery coat, she said, and then I'm going to think. Dora left. Abigail finished the Ellery coat. She thought. What she thought was this: Thomas Briggs had spent 5 years deciding she wasn't worth staying for. He had said as much to 6 people in a church hall and had ridden away with his dignity intact and his conscience apparently clear. She had spent 5 years building something from the rubble of that building, it slowly and carefully and entirely by herself, the way she built everything. Her business, her reputation, her life. Nathan Walker had spent 3 weeks seeing that life and deciding it was worth sitting down next to. The fear was real. She was not going to tell herself it wasn't. The fear was real, and it was old, and it had good reason to be there because she had trusted before, and the trust had been used against her. She understood the fear completely. But she was also sitting at her workbench in the lamplit evening of a Wednesday in August, beginning to understand something else. She was tired of the fear winning. She had let the fear win for 5 years. She had let Thomas Briggs, a man who had not deserved a single hour of her time, determine the shape of her heart for 5 years. She had built walls and called them independence, and told herself she was fine, and she had been fine. She had survived and thrived in all the ways that survival and thriving looked like from the outside. But Emma had said it on the platform before the stage left. You've been surviving. You deserve to see what living feels like. She put down the pattern. She was going to go talk to Nathan. She stood up, took off her work apron, and was reaching for her shawl when the knock came. Not the door to the street. The side door, the one that opened to the alley behind the shop, the one she used for supply deliveries. 3 knocks, and then a pause, and then one more. She opened it. Nathan Walker was standing in the alley with his hat in his hands, and the evening behind him, and an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the calm, not the near smile, not the patient waiting. Something that had cost him something to come here with. Something raw around the edges. I said I wouldn't chase you, he said. You did say that. I'm choosing not to consider this chasing, he said. I'm considering it a conversation I needed to have before I let tonight end without having it. She opened the door wider and stepped back. He came in. He stood in the middle of her workshop, the place where she made things, where she was most completely and entirely herself. And he looked at her with the rawness still on his face, and he said, "I need to know if Thomas Briggs broke something today that I don't know how to fix." "He didn't break anything," she said. "Abigail." He said her name with all the weight of 3 weeks of paying attention behind it. "Don't tell me what you think I need to hear. Tell me the truth." She looked at him for a long moment. "He frightened me," she said. "Not him specifically, what he represents, what it felt like when it went wrong before." She kept her voice steady with real effort. "You haven't done anything wrong. This isn't about you. This is about me and the size of what I'm afraid of, and the fact that I can feel myself caring what happens with you, and I don't know how to be careful enough with that." He was quiet. Then he crossed the room, not fast, not slow, and he stopped in front of her at a distance that respected her space and held her gaze and said, "I don't need you to be careful with it. I need you to know that whatever you feel, I can hold it. The good and the scared both." "You don't know," she started. "I know enough," he said. "I know you built this business from nothing. I know you mended my shirts better than they were made. I know you drove Thomas Briggs off with 2 sentences this morning without flinching. I know you give Dora Hutchins twice as much grace as she deserves, and you know exactly what you're doing when you do it." He paused. "And I know that whatever you're afraid of, it is not bigger than who you are." She stood very still. The lamp was burning on the workbench. The evening was quiet around the shop. Somewhere outside, Willow Ridge was finishing its Wednesday dishes, washing horses, stabled lights going out one by one. "I was going to come find you," she said. "Before you knocked, I was putting on my shawl." Something in his face shifted, the rawness of it softened just slightly at the edges. "Were you?" he said. "I've been sitting here for 3 hours deciding to stop being scared," she said. "I hadn't quite finished deciding, and then you knocked." "Did the knocking help?" he said, and there was the near smile again, the one that didn't ask for anything. She looked at him, at the hat in his hands, at the man who had drawn a sewing room into his ranch plans 2 days after meeting her and had never once mentioned it until today. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I've spent 5 years not doing it, and I've gotten very good at not doing it." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be good at it right away. You're asking me to try." "I'm asking you to consider trying," he said. "When you're ready, at whatever pace makes sense to you." He turned his hat brim once in his hands. "I'll still be here." She thought about the southern room with the windows. She thought about the wild horses in the valley. She thought about the thread in her supply drawer, the exact shade of Morrison brown. She thought about Thomas Briggs's face when Nathan Walker had said, "This conversation is done," and how Nathan had not looked at her afterward to check if she'd seen it. He hadn't done it for her to see. He'd done it because it needed doing. "I'd like to see the ranch again," she said. "After you sign the papers, when it's yours." His expression did something she hadn't seen before. Something full and quiet and entirely genuine. The expression of a man who had been holding himself very carefully and had just been given permission to put some of it down. "Friday," he said. "I sign Friday." "Saturday morning then," she said. "I'll bring the corn pudding." "I thought the corn pudding was for special occasions," he said. "Buying land is a special occasion," she said. "Don't push it." He laughed. The real one, not the near smile, the full unguarded sound of it filling her workshop. And it was a good sound, the kind of sound that a room held on to after it stopped. "Saturday morning," he said. He put his hat back on, settled it the way he always settled it. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night, Nathan." He went out the side door. She stood alone in her workshop for a moment with the lamp and the quiet and the half-finished Ellery coat and the supply drawer with the Morrison thread in it. Then she sat back down at her workbench. She was not done being scared. She understood that. Fear like hers didn't resolve in one evening over a knocked side door. It was going to be there tomorrow and probably the day after. And there would be mornings when the weight of Thomas Briggs's voice in a church hall would feel heavier than the weight of everything Nathan Walker had said and done in 3 careful weeks. But she was also, for the first time in 5 years, choosing not to let the fear make the decision. Saturday morning felt possible. Saturday morning felt in the specific, terrifying way of things that were actually real, like a beginning. She picked up her needle. She put it down again. She sat very still in the lamplit quiet of the workshop she had built from nothing in the town that had watched her survive. And she said one thing out loud, to no one at all. The way you said the true things when you finally stopped being afraid of the sound of them. "All right," she said. "All right." The lamp burned on. Outside, Willow Ridge settled into its Wednesday night doors, closing fires, banking low. The dark sky over Montana, thick with summer stars. And somewhere across town in his room at Calloway's, Nathan Walker sat on the edge of his bed and thought about southern windows and the way the morning had felt on the ridge before Thomas Briggs came up the hill. And then afterward, how she had handed him the plans. With her hands steady and her chin level, not collapsed, not broken, just holding. He thought about the sound of her voice saying, "Saturday morning then." He lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and allowed himself carefully, and for the first time, the particular kind of relief that comes when you have been hoping for something for a long time, and the evidence finally begins to suggest you were right to. Just the relief of it. Just that. For now, that was enough. Saturday morning came the way important mornings always came, quietly, without announcement, as if it didn't know what it was carrying. Abigail was up before 5. She told herself it was habit, which was true. She told herself it had nothing to do with the fact that Nathan Walker had signed the papers on Friday afternoon, and she had agreed to ride out to his land properly, his now with corn pudding and whatever remained of her nerve. She made the corn pudding first. She made it the way her mother had taught her, which was not written down anywhere, and which she had never once made for company, because it was the kind of dish you made for people who mattered. And she had spent 5 years being very careful about who she let matter. She stood in her small kitchen behind the workshop and measured by feel and told herself she was being practical. She was not being practical. She was terrified in the specific way of someone who has decided to be brave and is now standing at the exact moment the decision becomes real. Nathan was at her door at 7. He knocked twice, his knock the deliberate one, and when she opened the door, he looked at the dish in her hands and then at her face, and he said nothing about either, which was exactly right. They rode out in the early morning cool. High had bought the land. All 480 acres of it, signed and recorded at the county office, the deed in his jacket pocket. The way important things got carried close without display. He told her the final price as they rode the same plain way. He told her everything, and she did the arithmetic in her head, and understood what 8 years of ranch work and careful saving looked like when you added it all up. "You didn't keep anything back," she said. "I kept enough for the first season's cattle and building materials," he said. "The rest went into the land. Land's the only thing that doesn't lose value if you care for it, right?" She thought about that. About a man who had worked 8 years toward a single purpose and had not wavered from it, had not spent the money on comfort or convenience or any of the 100 small ways a person could bleed a savings account dry and call it living. Just kept building toward the thing. "You've been patient your whole life," she said. "With things worth being patient for," he said. She looked at the road ahead of them. The Hargrove land. Nathan's land looked different on a Saturday with the deed signed. She felt the difference before she could name it. Something had shifted in the way the air sat over it. Or maybe that was her own perception, shifting her own sense of what the place was allowed to mean, now that it belonged to someone she knew. They walked the property again, but differently from Wednesday. Wednesday had been a showing, a presentation of possibility. Saturday was something else, quieter, more settled, the walk of two people who were both trying to understand what they were to each other by moving through a shared space and seeing what it felt like. He showed her where the house would begin. He had stakes in the ground, already had put them in. Thursday afternoon, she guessed, because they had the look of something done the day after a decision. He walked her around the perimeter of what would be the main structure and named each room as they passed it, and when they reached the southern side, he stopped. "Here," he said. She knew before he said it. "The windows will face there," he said, indicating south. "Full morning light all the way through to early afternoon. Separate entry from the side so you don't have to go through the house." He paused. "I measured for a cutting table 8 feet long. But I'd want you to tell me if that's wrong. She stood inside the staked perimeter of her workshop. Not her workshop. Nothing. Yet just marked earth and possibility. And felt the morning sun on her face. And thought about fabric laid out on an 8-foot cutting table in full southern light. 8 feet is right, she said quietly. He nodded once. They sat on the flat rock near the south spring and ate the corn pudding straight from the dish with 2 spoons he had brought in his saddlebag, which she suspected was not an improvisation, and they talked about the building timeline and the cattle he planned to bring up from Wyoming and the fence work that would need doing before winter. She told him about the ranch families she sewed for the specific needs of work clothing in hard country, where things wore through first, how to reinforce the seams that mattered, what cut worked best for a man who spent half his day on horseback. He listened with the focus of someone filing information away for real use. You could design the work clothing for the hands, he said. When I bring on hands, something built for actual work instead of catalog nonsense. She looked at him. You'd want that. I'd want functional clothing on the people working my land, he said. You're the best person in 3 counties who knows how to make that. It's practical. You always frame it as practical, she said. Most things I believe are also practical, he said. That's not an accident. She scraped the last of the pudding from the edge of the dish and thought about it. Thought about what it meant that he had built her work into his plans, not as an afterthought, not as something she could keep doing if she wanted, but something that would eventually recede as domestic life expanded, but as a structural element. A room with a separate entry, clothing contracts for the ranch, her expertise treated as a resource. Nathan, she said. He looked at her. Why me, she said. It came out more direct than she intended, but she had decided after Wednesday night that she was done managing what she said to this man. Emma gave you a name and a description, and you came 300 miles. You could have met any number of women. Why did Emma's letter make you get on your horse? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, the quiet of someone taking it seriously. Emma said her sister built something from nothing, he said. She said you were honest, and you were kind, and you were lonely in the quiet way that people don't see unless they're paying attention. He paused. And she said that someone had told you that you weren't worth loving as you are, and that you'd been carrying that ever since. He looked at her steadily. I've met men who were told they weren't worth anything, and they either collapsed under it, or they came out mean. I've never met a woman who was told she wasn't worth loving and turned around and built herself a life anyway. I wanted to know what that looked like up close. Abigail sat very still. That's not a romantic reason, she said. No, he agreed. That was the first reason. The reasons after are more romantic. She looked at the dish in her hands. What are the reasons after? You said I am not a problem to be solved on the first day, and you meant it completely, he said. You called Thomas Briggs by his full name and told me who he was without explaining or apologizing or adding anything to soften it. You pay Dora Hutchins twice the grace she deserves because you've decided she's worth the effort. He stopped. And you make the best corn pudding I have ever tasted in my life, which is not a small thing. She laughed. Genuinely, unexpectedly, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere unguarded because you weren't watching for it. It had been a long time since she'd laughed like that. Nathan was watching her with an expression she was only now learning to read, the full settled one, the one that appeared when he had been hoping for something and it arrived. There it is, he said quietly. There what is? That, he said. The real one. You've got a careful smile you use most of the time, and then you've got that one and that one. He stopped himself, looked out at the valley. She waited. That one is worth riding 300 miles for, he said. The heat came up her face before she could stop it. Not embarrassment exactly, but the particular feeling of being seen accurately, which was more intimate than being complimented and considerably harder to deflect. She did not deflect it. She sat with it, which was new. They rode back to Willow Ridge in the late morning. At the edge of he slowed his horse level with hers and said, "There's a thing I want to ask you." She looked at him. "The Harvest Festival is 3 weeks out," he said. "Willow Ridge does it up at the community ground from what Porter tells me. Supper and dancing and the whole business. He held her gaze directly. I'd like you to come with me. Not by accident. Not because we happened to both be there. With me deliberately in front of the town. There it was. The thing that had been building since the Sunday supper, since the coffee at May's, since the workshop conversation, and the side door knock, and the staked ground of a sewing room facing south. The thing that Willow Ridge had been assembling its opinions about for 5 weeks and would now have concrete evidence for. She thought about Clara Wilson, about Hattie Graves, about Chester Pollard's assessment in Henderson's Dry Goods, that she was probably desperate enough to be useful. She thought about Thomas Briggs on that hillside, and the way Nathan had said this conversation is done. She thought about the corn pudding dish and 2 spoons brought on purpose. Yes, she said. He looked at her like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Yes, she said again, steady and clear. Deliberately, in front of the town. He exhaled once, a careful exhale, the kind that held something it had been keeping. All right, he said. 3 weeks. She rode the last 2 blocks to her shop alone, and dismounted and tied the roan and stood for a moment with her hand on the door latch and thought, all right. All right then. She had 4 orders to finish, and 3 weeks to figure out what to wear to a harvest festival. She went inside. The following days had a different quality to them. She noticed the difference the way you noticed a change in weather, not in one dramatic moment, but gradually, in the accumulation of small things. She woke up thinking about the day ahead, rather than about what she needed to survive in it. She found herself at her workbench humming, which she hadn't done in years, and when she noticed, she didn't stop. She made decisions in her order book with more certainty than she'd had in months, because her mind wasn't spending half its energy on the background management of loneliness. Nathan was working. The ranch had a crew of 2 up from Porter Hayes's operation, doing the initial building work, framing the foundation, hauling timber from the eastern ridge. He came into town most evenings covered in sawdust, and satisfied in the way of a man whose days were going the direction he'd pointed them. He came to May's most evenings. So did she. It was not a secret. It was not presented as a secret. They sat at the counter and drank coffee and talked, and May refilled their cups with the particular benevolent neutrality of a woman who had been hoping for this specific development and was determined not to say so. The town watched. The town always watched. The watching had changed, though, slightly, incrementally. Not the cruel watching that didn't disappear, but something else had been added to it. Porter Hayes had told someone who had told someone else that Nathan Walker was building a sewing studio into the house plans. That detail had moved through Willow Ridge with remarkable efficiency, because it was the kind of detail that people didn't quite know what to do with a man building something for a woman, not as a gift or an incentive, but as a simple acknowledgement of who she was. It didn't fit the story the town had been telling about Abigail Carter and Willow Ridge. Like all small towns got uncomfortable when reality stopped fitting its stories. Dora Hutchins came into the shop on a Tuesday, with 3 bolts of fabric she'd been meaning to have made into curtains for 2 years, and placed them on the counter with the decisive energy of a woman making a statement. I want these done before the cold sets in, she said. Good fabric, good work, whatever your rate. Abigail looked at the bolts. Good fabric was right. Dora had good taste, she'd give her that. She named her price without discounting. Fine, Dora said without haggling. She sat in the consultation chair. I told Hattie Graves she was wrong, she said. Abigail looked up. Last week, Dora said. She was saying what she usually says. I told her she was wrong, and she'd been wrong for years, and she should think about the kind of person she wanted to be before she said another word on the subject. She straightened her hat. I thought you should know. Abigail set down her measuring tape. Dora, she said. It needed saying, Dora said with the brisk tone of someone who was not going to make more of this than it was. Now, can you do the curtains by the 15th? I can do them by the 12th, Abigail said. Good. Dora stood. He's good for you, she said, not looking at Abigail. I know you know that. I'm just saying it out loud so it's been said by someone other than your sister. She walked to the door. The 12th, then. She left. Abigail stood alone in her shop for a moment. Then she picked up the measuring tape and started on the curtains. Thomas Briggs had been in town for 8 days when it happened. She had managed to not encounter him again. Willow Ridge was small, but it wasn't that small, and she had learned the geography of avoiding people she didn't want to see over the course of 30 years. She knew which hours Chester Pollard came into town, and she knew the Pollards were hosting Thomas, so she adjusted accordingly. It wasn't difficult. It was just the ordinary maintenance of a life that had required maintenance. What she had not anticipated was the letter. It arrived on a Wednesday morning in an envelope she didn't recognize until she saw the handwriting, and then she recognized it immediately because it was the handwriting of a man who had signed his name at the bottom of a letter she'd kept for 2 years before she burned it. She stood at her work table with the envelope in her hand and felt the cold move through her chest. She almost didn't open it. She opened it. Abigail. I know I don't have the right to write to you. I know that. I've been knowing it for 5 years, and it didn't stop me from doing things I don't have the right to do, which is apparently a pattern I haven't fixed yet. I saw you on the Hargrove property last week. I saw you with him. I told myself I rode out there on business, but that's not entirely true, and I'm trying to be honest, which is something I should have tried considerably earlier. I want to say I'm sorry, not as a strategy. Not because I think you owe me anything for it, just because I am. What I said in the church hall, I said in front of people who didn't need to hear it, and I said it because I was a coward who wanted witnesses to make it feel more final, and you didn't deserve any part of that. I don't know what Walker is to you. It looked like something real. If it is, I hope you let it be. Thomas. She read it twice. Then she set it on the work table and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you looked at something you weren't sure was safe to touch. Thomas Briggs had written her an apology, a real one or something that had the architecture of a real one, the specific acknowledgement of what he'd done and why and what it had cost her. She was aware that it might not be entirely without strategy. She was also aware with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 5 years living with the damage that the apology changed. Nothing about what had happened, and also that hearing it, reading it, feeling the weight of his acknowledging it, did something small and real to the shape of the wound. Not healed it, just acknowledged it. The way a witness acknowledged a thing. The way naming something correctly gave you a slightly different relationship to it. She folded the letter and put it in her workbench drawer. She sat for a long time. Then she went to find Nathan. How was at the building site? She could hear the hammering from the road. She rode out on the roan with no corn pudding and no particular plan, just the letter in her head and the need to be in the company of someone she trusted. She found him on top of the half-framed south wall, which was farther along than she'd expected, the building rising out of the staked earth with real momentum now. He saw her coming and came down off the wall and said something to the 2 men with him, and they went to work somewhere on the other side of the frame, and he walked out to meet her. You came out on a Wednesday, he said. He could see something in her face. He always could. Thomas wrote me a letter, she said. He was still. An apology, she said. A real one or something close to it. She paused. I don't want to talk about what it said. I needed to not be alone with it for a while. He looked at her. All right, he said simply. That's all, she said. What else would I say? She thought about what someone else might have said. Might have wanted to know what was in the letter, might have been jealous or threatened, or made it about himself in some way. Nathan Walker was looking at her with the calm, undivided focus of a man whose primary interest was that she was all right. Come see how far we've gotten, he said, and turned toward the frame. She tied the roan and walked with him through what would be the front door, and stood in the middle of what would be the main room, the walls only chest high yet, but the shape of it clear. He told her about the work, what they'd finished, what remained the timber they were waiting on for the roof framing. He showed her where the kitchen would be, and the front room and the hallway. And then they came around to the south side, and she stepped through the opening of what would be her room. It was further framed than the rest of the house. She noticed immediately. The south wall was fully studded, the window openings cut, and framed, the separate entry clearly marked. He had prioritized it. She stood in it. The morning light was coming through the window openings exactly as he'd described, full and southern and steady, the kind of light you could work by all day without strain. She stood in her room, still just framed earth and fresh timber, still just the bones of a thing. She started crying. She didn't plan it, didn't feel it coming. One moment she was standing in the October morning light, and the next her face was doing something she hadn't let it do in a very long time, and she turned away because it was her instinct to turn away from being seen in the raw moments to present only the controlled version. Nathan put his hand on her shoulder. Not her arm, not her hand. Her shoulder solid, present, a hand that was simply there. "You don't have to turn away," he said quietly. She didn't turn back. "I never cry," she said. Her voice was wrecked and she hated it. "You're crying now," he said. "I'm aware." Abigail. He said her name the way he always said it, with the full weight of 3 months behind it. "Turn around." She turned around. She was not a woman who looked appealing. When she cried, she knew this about herself, had always known, it had used it as another reason not to. Her face did messy things when she cried, went blotchy and unguarded, all the careful composure that she maintained as a matter of daily survival, just gone. Nathan Walker looked at her crying face with the same direct, undivided attention he gave everything. "There's nothing to be ashamed of," he said. "I know," she said, and her voice broke on it, which made it worse. "No, you don't," he said gently, "but absolutely. If you knew it, you wouldn't have tried to turn away." He kept his hand on her shoulder. "You've been keeping yourself held together for a very long time. You're allowed to put some of that down." She pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed and told herself to stop, and her eyes kept going, which was the particular injustice of crying when you'd decided not to. "The room," she said when she could speak. "You put the windows in already." "The framing," he said. "The actual windows are on order from Bozeman." "You ordered them before you—" She stopped. He waited. "You ordered them before you knew what I would say," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I ordered them because I was going to build the room either way," he said. "Whether you chose it or not. I didn't want to build something incomplete." He paused. "And because I thought you'd choose it." She looked at him through her entirely undignified, crying face. "You were sure," she said. "I was hopeful," he said. "Those are different things. I've been hopeful my whole life. It's what keeps you building." She stood in the framed room with the morning light coming through the window openings and the half-built ranch around her, and she thought about the letter in her workbench drawer. She thought about Thomas Briggs riding up that hill looking for something he'd thrown away and couldn't get back. She thought about 5 years of surviving and what it cost and what it built and what it couldn't build, no matter how good you were at it. She thought about what living felt like, just beginning to learn the shape of it. "Nathan," she said. "Abigail." "I want to choose it," she said. Not cautiously, not with the careful qualifications she'd been putting around everything for months. Directly the way he told her things. "I'm not saying I know how to do any of this without being afraid. I'm saying I want to choose it anyway." Something moved across his face, the full, unguarded version of the near smile, the one she realized she'd been watching him work toward since the first day, the one that was too large and too real to be contained in something as small as a near. "Then you choose it," he said simply. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I probably look terrible." "You look like yourself," he said. "I like yourself." She laughed despite herself, the unguarded one, the real one, the one he'd said was worth 300 miles. It came out rough around the edges from the crying, but it came. He was smiling fully now. She had not seen it before. The real smile, unreserved, the smile of a man who had gotten somewhere he'd been working toward for a long time. It was a good smile. It changed his whole face. "All right," she said, pulling herself together with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who had learned to bounce back from her own emotions on a tight schedule. "Show me where the cutting table will go." He laughed. "Right now." 8 feet, you said. Show me where." He showed her. They spent 20 minutes in the framed sewing room, with Nathan pointing out measurements, and Abigail asking specific practical questions about light angles and shelf placement and ventilation. And the 2 men on the other side of the frame occasionally glanced over and then went back to their work, with the careful discretion of employees who understood what they were seeing. When she rode back to Willow Ridge, she felt different, not lighter. Exactly. The fear was still there. The old wound was still there. Thomas's letter was still in her drawer. But something had been added to the weight that made it carry differently. Something that felt, she thought, like foundation. Like something to stand on rather than something to stand against. She had chosen it, not because Emma had arranged it. Not because she was lonely enough to take what arrived. Because she had stood in a room built for her work and looked at a man who had built it without knowing for certain she'd come, and she had decided clearly, deliberately, with full knowledge of the risk, to let it be real. That evening she wrote to Emma. She did not write about the crying or the room or the 2 spoons on a flat rock. She wrote about the Harvest Festival in 3 weeks, and that Nathan Walker was taking her to it deliberately in front of the town. She wrote about the curtain order from Dora Hutchins. She wrote about the Morrison Fall cattle order and the new stitching pattern she'd worked out for canvas that saved half the time on reinforcement. At the bottom she wrote, "You were right. I'm not going to say it again, and I'm not going to say it to your face because you'll be insufferable about it. But I'm writing it once, so you know that I know it." He drew the room into the plans 2 days after meeting me. The windows face south. I chose it. Your sister who loves you even when she wants to throttle you, Abigail. She sealed the letter and set it for the Morning Post. Then she went back to the Dora Hutchins curtains, which she finished at 11 that night, 3 days ahead of schedule. Outside Willow Ridge was dark and quiet. 2 weeks to the Harvest Festival. The building frame on the Hargrove land, Nathan's land, was rising 1 course of timber at a time, and in the locked drawer of her workbench, underneath the thread and the spare needles and the folded order forms, Thomas Briggs's letter sat unopened no longer and unburned for the first time. She would not keep it long, but she was not ready to burn it yet, because burning it meant being finished with the grief of it, and being finished with the grief of it meant she had carried it long enough to set it down, and setting it down meant it no longer controlled the size of the life she was willing to build. She was getting there, one chosen thing at a time. She was getting there. The Harvest Festival came on a Saturday in late September, when the air had that particular Montana edge to it, the first honest cold of the season, pressing down from the mountains, reminding everyone that summer didn't live here permanently and never had. Abigail spent Friday evening on her dress, not altering it, not fixing something wrong with it. She had made this dress specifically over the past 2 weeks in the evenings, after orders were finished, a deep garnet wool that she'd ordered from the Bozeman catalog the day after she told Nathan yes. She had cut it to fit herself the way she cut everything she made for other women, precisely, honestly, without apology for the shape it was meant to cover. Full through the hips, generous through the shoulders, tailored at the waist, in the way that acknowledged she had one. She had put careful work into the collar and the cuffs and the buttons, because the details were where the character of a garment lived. She stood in front of her small mirror on Friday night and looked at herself in it. She had spent 30 years learning not to linger in mirrors. Not from vanity, the opposite of vanity, which was the specific unkindness of deciding you weren't worth looking at. She had built the habit young, after the first time she saw someone else see her reflection and make a face. She looked now. The dress was good. She had made it well the way she made everything, and it fit the way good clothes fit, not disguising anything, not performing anything, just working with what was actually there. She looked like herself, the full, complete, unapologetic version of herself that she had been working toward for months. She decided that was enough. She went to bed. Nathan knocked at 7 the next morning, same as always, and when she opened the door, he looked at the dress and then at her face and said, "You made that." "This week," she said. "It's the best thing you've ever made," he said. She looked at him. He had a clean shirt on the collar she'd repaired, pressed carefully. He had shaved. His hat was brushed. "You look good too," she said. The near smile. "I tried." They walked to the festival together, not riding. Walking down the main road of Willow Ridge in the Saturday morning side by side, not touching, but close enough that the deliberateness of it was visible to anyone paying attention, which in Willow Ridge meant everyone. She felt the watching. She had always felt the watching. Today, for the first time, she did not adjust herself for it. She did not walk smaller or faster. She did not look at the ground or find a reason to glance away. She walked at her own pace beside Nathan Walker in her garnet wool dress, and she let the town see her doing it, and she did not perform anything for them in either direction, not defiance, not indifference. Just the simple radical fact of existing in her own life without apology. Nathan tipped his hat to old Mr. Hennessy on the boardwalk. Mr. Hennessy looked at them both and said, "Morning, Walker. Morning, Miss Carter. Glad you two could make it." She nearly stopped walking. Mr. Hennessy had said her name the way you said the name of someone who belonged somewhere. Not the name of a spectacle or a question or a piece of town gossip. Just her name, combined with Nathan's, as if they were a regular thing that regular people said good morning to. "Good morning, Mr. Hennessy," she said. They kept walking. "Did that just—" she started. "Yes," Nathan said. He was looking straight ahead. "It did." She pressed her lips together and kept her face exactly where it was and felt something warm and dangerous move through her chest. The community grounds were already full when they arrived. Tables set up in the same configuration as the summer supper, the church ladies managing the food. Porter Hayes holding court at one end, with several of the surrounding ranchers' children running the same inexplicable patterns they always ran. The Harvest Festival had a particular energy. The relief of a summer's work concluded the bracing knowledge of winter. Coming the collective exhale of a rancher community that had made it through another season. Abigail had come to every Harvest Festival for 12 years. Alone. Carrying something to contribute and leaving before the dancing started. Because the dancing was not something you attended alone, without attracting a specific quality of pity that she had no patience for. She was not alone this year. Porter Hayes saw them first. He detached himself from his group with a deliberateness that meant he'd been watching for them and crossed the grounds to meet them, which caused a ripple in the surrounding conversations, because Porter Hayes walking toward someone was an event and everyone knew it. He shook Nathan's hand. Then he turned to Abigail and he did something she had never once seen Porter Hayes do. He took off his hat. "Miss Carter," he said, "that's a fine dress." She stared at him. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "I made it myself." "I know you did," he said. "That's why I said it." He put his hat back on, nodded at Nathan with the satisfaction of a man who had bet on something and was watching it pay, and walked back to his group. Nathan looked at her. She looked at Nathan. "Porter Hayes complimented your dress," he said. "Porter Hayes has never once commented on any piece of clothing in his life," she said. "He doesn't notice clothing. He noticed yours." She turned back to the festival grounds and breathed carefully. "I need to put down the pie," she said. She had brought a dried apple pie, which was different from the corn pudding, a festival food, a public food. She had made it Thursday evening. "Go," he said. "I'll find you." She carried the pie to the food tables. May Henderson was there managing the arrangement of contributed dishes, and May looked at her, and then at the garnet dress, and then at the direction Nathan had gone, and May's face did an entire silent conversation that Abigail pretended not to see. "Dried apple," Abigail said, setting down the pie. "Beautiful," May said, and she was definitely not talking about the pie. "May." "I didn't say a word," May said, and turned to rearrange something that didn't need rearranging. The morning unfolded, the way festival mornings unfolded in layers, with accumulating texture. Nathan found her again, and they moved through the grounds together, and he introduced her where introductions were needed as Abigail Carter, the best seamstress in the county. Not as his companion, not with any qualifier that would have made it smaller. Just her name, and her work presented as the primary facts of her identity. She shook hands with 3 ranchers from the eastern part of the county she'd never met. She discussed canvas workwear specifications with 2 of them who were interested in the reinforced stitching pattern she'd developed. She found herself in a conversation about fabric durability that she hadn't been invited into. She'd been invited in because Nathan had said her name and her expertise, and the ranchers had turned to her like she was someone worth talking to, which she had always been. The difference was that someone had said so out loud in the right company. Clara Wilson was there. Abigail saw her from across the grounds, saw her notice them, saw the look that crossed her face. The "I give it 2 weeks" look, the one she'd said at the summer supper, the one Nathan had heard and ignored. Clara looked at them standing together in the September morning. Abigail in her garnet dress, and Nathan beside her with his hand at the small of her back, in the easy way of a man who had been given permission, and something shifted in Clara's expression. Not apology. Abigail wasn't expecting apology, just recalculation, the look of someone updating their story. Hattie Graves was there too. Hattie looked at them, and then looked away, and did not approach, which from Hattie was practically a white flag. Dora Hutchins found Abigail at the food table during the midday meal, and said under her breath, with the private satisfaction of someone who had been right about something important, "I told you." "You did," Abigail said. "The dress is magnificent." "Thank you, Dora." "I want one," Dora said. "Same quality, different color, after the holiday orders." "I'll put you on the list," Abigail said. Dora squeezed her arm once quickly the way women did when they meant something they weren't going to say more elaborately, and walked away. The afternoon moved. The food happened. The conversations happened. And then the dancing started. Abigail had not danced at a public event since before Thomas Briggs. She had not allowed herself to because dancing was visible in a particular way, the way of bodies in motion, in company, in the context of celebration, and she had not been willing to be visible like that without armor. Nathan was beside her when the fiddle started. He did not ask. He held out his hand. She looked at his hand, the hand that had lifted her off the roan on the ridge, the hand that had pressed warm and steady on her shoulder in the framed room when she cried, the hand that had set the thread on her counter, exact shade of Morrison brown, without making it into anything except practical. She took it. They moved on to the open ground where other couples were forming up, and she was aware of herself with the full awareness of a woman who had spent 30 years knowing exactly how much space her body occupied and what people thought about it, and she moved through that awareness, and she danced. She was a good dancer. She had forgotten that. She had the rhythm that came from years of physical work, the body knowledge of someone who understood fabric and motion and how things moved through space. Nathan was solid and sure, and he led without leading, which was the best kind, the kind that made you feel like you'd decided every step yourself. She didn't look at the watching people. She looked at Nathan, and Nathan looked at her, and the fiddle played on, and somewhere in the middle of the second song, she stopped being a spectacle in her own mind, and became just a woman, dancing with a man she had chosen on a Saturday in September in the town where she had built her life. That was when she heard it. Not a cruel voice this time. Not Hattie Graves, or Clara Wilson, or Chester Pollard. It was a voice she placed immediately. May Henderson, talking to Reverend Moore's wife at the edge of the dancing ground. Not whispering, just talking in the normal tone of people talking about ordinary things. "She looks happy," May said. "I don't think I've ever seen her look like that." Reverend Moore's wife said something Abigail couldn't hear. "She deserves it," May said simply. "Lord knows she's been patient enough." Abigail kept dancing. Her eyes were suddenly doing the thing they had done in the framed room, the thing she had no control over, and she pressed her lips together and breathed and focused on Nathan's shoulder and the sound of the fiddle. Nathan felt the change in her. He always did. "All right," he said quietly. "May Henderson just said I look happy," she said. He looked at her. "Are you?" She thought about the question. Really thought about it the way she thought about pattern problems from multiple angles checking the math. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." "Good," he said, and they kept dancing. Thomas Briggs left Willow Ridge the following Monday. She heard it from Dora, who heard it from someone at the stage stop. He had completed his land business, whatever it had actually been, and ridden back toward Bozeman without further incident. She waited for the feeling of his leaving to be significant in some way, to require processing to open something up in her chest. It didn't. I was just gone. The way a stone goes when you finally set it down. You notice the absence of the weight briefly, and then you move. She burned the letter that evening. Not dramatically. Just set it in the stove with the evening's kindling, and watched it go, and felt when the paper curled and darkened and disappeared the specific lightness of being done with something. She was done. The ranch went up through October with the speed of men who knew what they were building and why. Nathan had brought on 2 hands, permanently brothers from Wyoming, solid workers, the kind who asked the right questions and then did the job. The main house framing was completed by the 2nd week. The barn followed. By the 3rd week, the roof was on the main house, and Nathan was riding into town every evening in the particular state of exhaustion that sat well on a man, because it came from making something real. Abigail went out to the property every Saturday. She brought food, not always corn pudding, not always pie. Sometimes just bread, sometimes a pot of beans she'd made Friday evening. She sat on the flat rock by the South Spring and talked to Nathan while he ate, and they talked about the building and the cattle coming up from Wyoming in the spring and the clothing contract she was drafting for the ranch hands. 4 sets of reinforced work clothes per man, designed specifically for the elevation and the cold and the specific demands of cattle work at altitude. It was on one of those Saturdays in the 3rd week of October that she walked into the sewing room. The windows were in. The Bozeman windows had arrived the week prior, 4 of them on the south wall, properly framed and glazed, and the light through them was exactly what Nathan had promised that August morning when he'd said full morning light all the way through to early afternoon. She stood in the room. The walls were up. The floor was laid plank pine smooth, good for moving around a work table without catching on rough edges. The separate entry door was hung and plumb. The room was empty except for light and the smell of fresh timber and the sound of hammering somewhere on the far side of the house. Nathan came through the interior doorway and stopped when he saw her standing there. "Windows came out well," he said. "They did," she said. "Floor's level," he said. "I checked it twice. I can feel it," she said. She could the particular evenness underfoot that you noticed when you spent your days at a work table and knew the difference between a floor you could trust and one you couldn't. "Shelving," Nathan said. "I need to know where you want it, north wall, south wall, or both." She looked at the walls, thought about bolts of fabric, about thread organization, about the natural workflow of a cutting table versus a sewing station. "Both," she said. "Low on the north to floor level, high on the south so it doesn't block the light." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote that down. The same notebook she'd seen him carry since the 1st week. She had never asked to look at it, but she knew it held the details of the ranch measurements, costs, decisions, the accumulated specifics of building something from nothing. "You're in the notebook," she said. He looked up. "The shelving," she said. "You're writing it down." "Everything important goes in the notebook," he said simply, and wrote another line. She looked at the south windows. The light was coming through the way light came through good glass in late October, angled warm, the particular quality of fall sun that was stronger than it looked. She thought about a cutting table under those windows, 8 feet of it just like he'd said. "Nathan," she said. "Abigail, I want to move out here," she said. "In the spring when the house is ready. I want to close the Willow Ridge workshop and work out of this room and take the ranch clothing contracts as my primary business." She said it the way she'd learned to say things to him directly, without the careful qualifications she'd used for months, because he'd earned the unqualified version. "I'm not saying this because you built the room. I'm saying it because I've thought it through and it makes sense, and because—" She stopped. "Because," he said quietly. "Because I want to," she said. "For myself. Because I spent 5 years building a life I could survive in, and I'm ready to build one I actually want." He stood in the doorway of her room with his notebook in his hand, and looked at her. The way she had come to understand was the full version, the unreserved version, the Nathan Walker, who didn't manage himself quite as carefully as he usually did. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. "I'm scared, and I'm sure." "I can work with both of those," he said. She laughed. "The real one." He crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped in front of her with the proper distance. He always kept the distance of a man who asked before he assumed, and he said, "There's something I want to give you. It's not a ring. I want to say that first because I don't want you to think I'm asking something you haven't agreed to yet." She looked at him. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a small wooden box. palm-sized, made from the same pine as the floors. She could see the grain matched. He had made it himself. The lid had something carved into it that she had to look at twice before she understood her initials, AC, in clean, simple letters. She took the box. She opened it. Inside was a measuring tape. Not a purchased one, she could tell immediately from the feel of it. He had carved it himself from a lighter wood, flexible enough to use with markings. She looked at closely, and then looked at again. "You marked it," she said. "In inches," he said. "I looked up the standard in the library book." She turned it in her hands. He had made her a measuring tape, carved her initials into the box it sat in. She ran her thumb along the markings, and they were even, not perfect. Not a craftsman's work, but careful. The work of a man who had decided to make something, and made it as well as he could. "Turn it over," he said. She turned the tape over. On the back, in the small, careful letters of a man who wrote in notebooks, "I never came to change you. I came because I admired the woman you already are." She read it once. She read it again. She closed her hand around the measuring tape and held it and looked at Nathan Walker and did not try to stop the thing her face was doing. "You made this," she said. "3 evenings," he said. "I'm better with fence posts." "It's perfect," she said. "It's not perfect," he said. "The markings are slightly uneven on the second foot." "Nathan," she said. "Abigail." "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. The full look, the undivided one. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not as a performance, just as a question. The realest question asked by a man who already knew the answer, but understood that hearing it said out loud was the part that mattered. "Yes," she said. He exhaled the long, careful exhale she'd heard once before, on the Saturday she'd told him she'd come to the festival deliberately. The exhale of a man releasing something he'd been holding. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. They were married on a Saturday in November, 3 weeks before the first real snow came down from the mountains in the Willow Ridge Church, with Reverend Moore, and more people than Abigail had expected. She had not expected so many people. The pews were 3/4 full, ranch families from all over the county. May Henderson, Dora Hutchins in a hat that was genuinely extraordinary. Porter Hayes and his wife, the Henderson brothers who had been helping build the ranch, and who dressed up in a way that suggested they owned one good suit between them and had negotiated some arrangement. Emma came from Bozeman. She arrived Friday evening on the stage and came straight to the workshop and stood in the doorway with her traveling bag at her feet, and looked at her sister and said nothing for a moment. "Well," Emma said finally. "Don't," Abigail said. "I wasn't going to say a word." "You were about to say I told you so." "I was about to say," Emma said, setting down her bag, "that you look like someone who's been living rather than surviving, and I've been waiting a long time to see that." She crossed the room and put her arms around her sister. Abigail held on. "You were right," she said for the second time in her life. "I'm still not saying it to your face again." "You just did," Emma said. "I'm going to stop talking now," Abigail said. Emma laughed and held on tighter. The ceremony was short. Nathan had no family there. His parents were gone. No siblings, the particular solitude of a man who had been self-reliant since he was young and had made peace with it. He stood at the front of the church in the good shirt, not the collar. She'd repaired a new one she'd made him and watched her come down the aisle, and his face did the full, unreserved thing that she had learned to read and never got tired of seeing. She walked to him on her own feet at her own pace, in a dress she had made herself in the 2 weeks after he'd asked. Ivory wool with a fitted waist and a full skirt and collar work she'd spent 3 evenings on because she was constitutionally incapable of doing anything at less than her full capability, including getting married. Reverend Moore read the words. They said the things you said. They meant every syllable, which was more than most people managed, and it showed. When it was done, Nathan kissed her once properly, and then said against her ear, "The marking on the second foot of that tape is still slightly off." She pulled back and looked at him. "You're thinking about the tape right now." "I've been thinking about how to fix it for 3 weeks," he said. "I need a better tool." She stared at him for a moment, and then laughed. The real one, the unguarded one, right there in the front of the Willow Ridge Church, with everyone watching, and it echoed off the ceiling, the sound of it, and Nathan was laughing too, and Reverend Moore was smiling in the way of a man who had conducted enough weddings to recognize when two people were genuinely delighted by each other. Dora Hutchins said later that it was the best ceremony she'd been to in 20 years. What she meant, though she didn't say it exactly this way, was that it was the most honest, the most plainly itself. They moved to the ranch in March, when the last of the hard snow had cleared and the ground was solid enough for the wagon. Abigail packed the workshop in 3 days, organized precise every bolt of fabric and spool of thread and tool she owned, categorized and wrapped and loaded. She had sold the Willow Ridge lease to a young woman from Billings, who was setting up a millinery, which felt right. The first thing they carried into the house was not furniture. Nathan had set up her cutting table, 8 feet properly leveled, positioned exactly beneath the south windows, during the week before the move. And the first thing they carried in was the bolts of fabric, 6 of them, the working inventory for the spring ranch clothing orders. He carried 3, she carried 3, and they set them on the cutting table in the room with the south windows, and Abigail ran her hand along the edge of the table and felt the light on her face. "All right," Nathan said. "More than," she said. She set up the sewing room in 2 days. He stayed out of it, understood, without being told that this was her domain, her organization, her logic, and when she called him in on the second afternoon to show him the result, he stood in the doorway and took in the ordered shelving and the arranged threads and the cutting table under the windows, and he said, "It looks like you." "That's the idea," she said. "The measuring tape is on the shelf," he said. He had spotted it immediately, the small wooden box with her initials sitting on the shelf above the cutting table. "It lives there," she said. "I'll use it every day." The second foot marking. Nathan. "I have a better tool now," he said. "I could fix it." "If you touch that tape," she said, "I will redo every seam in every shirt you own." He looked at her. "Don't test me," she said. He held up both hands in surrender, and the near smile came, and she turned back to her shelving arrangement, and they were both smiling separately in the same room. Months passed. The ranch took shape the way things took shape when you built them right steadily without drama. One good decision at a time. The cattle came up from Wyoming in May, 37 head, and Nathan was on horseback at 4 in the morning for 3 weeks straight, moving them to the right pastures, and Abigail brought coffee out to him at the gate, because she was up anyway, working on the hand clothing orders, and the coffee was made, and it was practical. She hired a girl from town, Margaret, 17, quick hands willing to learn, to help with the volume. The ranch clothing contract had grown. Word traveled the way good work traveled, and by midsummer she had orders from 4 ranches in the county with a waiting list. She taught Margaret the reinforced seam technique on a Tuesday afternoon in September, in the room with the south windows, with the light coming through. The way it came through every afternoon, and the distant sound of Nathan and the hands working on the new south pasture fence. Margaret asked questions the way good apprentices asked specific, honest questions about why not, just how. Abigail answered them the same way she answered everything now, directly, without holding back the knowledge, because knowledge given freely multiplied. Willow Ridge had, in the way of small towns processing new information, updated its story. It didn't happen all at once. It never did. It happened in the accumulation of small revisions. Chester Pollard, ordering work trousers from Abigail's ranch line and telling his foreman they were the best built he'd ever owned. Clara Wilson's daughter ordering a dress for her autumn wedding, and Clara coming in to consult and being genuinely specifically complimentary about the cut. Hattie Graves, who never apologized for anything in her life, bringing preserves to the ranch in late summer, under the stated pretext of being neighborly, which everyone understood was as close to an apology as Hattie Graves would ever come. The town stopped talking about Abigail Carter's size, not because it had changed. It hadn't. She was exactly who she had always been, in exactly the body she had always had. The town stopped talking about it because there was nothing for the talk to attach to. Anymore, she was not a question or a cautionary tale or a thing that needed explaining. She was Abigail Walker, the best seamstress in the county, who ran a working operation out of her ranch and had built something real and clearly knew it. The story had changed its ending, and so the story changed. Emma visited in October, the first fall anniversary of the letter that had started everything. She came on the stage from Bozeman, and Nathan met her at the stop and drove her out to the ranch in the wagon. And she sat in the sewing room and drank coffee and looked at the south windows and said very little, which for Emma meant she was moved. "I was wrong to send him without asking you," Emma said finally. Abigail looked at her. "I know I was," Emma said. "I've known it this whole time. I was right about him, but I was wrong about the method, and those are two different things, and I owe you the distinction." Abigail sat with that. "You were wrong to send him without asking me," she said. "And you were right about one thing." Emma waited. "The hardest thing wasn't surviving alone," Abigail said. "I was good at that. I built something and I kept it, and I didn't fall apart." She looked at her sister steadily. "The hardest thing was believing I deserved to be loved exactly as I was." Emma's eyes went bright. "Abby, I'm not finished," Abigail said. "The hardest thing was believing it. And then it was choosing it anyway before I fully believed it, and letting the believing catch up." She paused. "That's the part nobody tells you. You don't have to believe it completely first. You just have to choose it enough times until the believing becomes true." Emma reached across the cutting table and took her sister's hand. They sat in the south light room and held on to each other the way sisters held on with the full weight of shared history. The fights and the distances, and the enormous presumptuous loving act that had started all of this, and the version of themselves that sat on a fence post at 18, talking about the lives they were going to have. This was the life, not the fantasy version. Not the version without cost or fear, or the long work of building trust from the ground up. The real one, specific and imperfect, and entirely completely hers. Nathan came in at noon, covered in the particular dust of an October morning's work, and looked at both of them sitting at the cutting table and said, "I'll make coffee." "It's already made," Abigail said. "Pour yours and sit down." He poured his coffee. He sat down. He fit into the room the way he fit into everything she had built, not by making himself smaller, not by taking more than his share, but by understanding exactly what was already there and choosing to be a part of it. Emma watched them. Later, walking back to the wagon for the drive to the stage stop, Emma leaned close to Abigail and said quietly, "The way he looked at you when he came in." "Don't," Abigail said. "Like you were the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life," Emma said. Abigail looked straight ahead. "Emma, I'm just saying what I saw." "I know what you saw," Abigail said. "I feel it every day." Emma squeezed her arm and said nothing more. Nathan drove the wagon, and Emma sat between them, and the October sky was enormous and blue overhead, and Abigail thought about 8 feet of cutting table and south-facing windows, and Morrison brown thread in exactly the right shade, and the measuring tape on the shelf with its slightly imperfect second-foot marking that she would never in her life let him fix. She thought about a man who had ridden 300 miles on the word of a letter, who had asked 2 questions. Was she kind? Did she keep her word, and then come to find out for himself? She thought about what it had cost her to let herself be found. She thought about what it had given her. Nathan and Abigail Walker spent the rest of their lives building that ranch one season at a time. Not because either of them had needed saving. Not because Emma had decided what was best and arranged it. Not because the town had approved or the fear had disappeared or the old wounds had vanished as if they'd never been. They built it because 2 people who had each carried their particular weight alone for a long time had found each other at the right moment, and had chosen slowly, honestly, with full knowledge of the risk to put some of that weight down and build something together instead. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was